Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Perhaps you're settling in after a long day, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of a mystery unfolding slowly, like turning the pages of an old case file by lamplight. Tonight, we travel to Millbrook, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, where the autumn of 2018 brought with it series of unexplained break-ins that would puzzle the local police department for months to come. The town, with its population of just under 3,000 residents, had always been the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with century-old maples that painted the sidewalks gold and crimson each fall. And the biggest excitement most years was the annual Harvest Festival held in the town square. Detective Sarah Chun had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 8 years when the first report came in on a Tuesday morning in late September. The morning air carried the crisp promise of winter, and frost still clung to the windows of the police station when Mrs. Eleanor Whitman called to report that someone had been in her house during the night. Mrs. Whitman, 73 years old and a retired librarian, lived alone in a 2-story Victorian home on Elm Street, the same house where she had raised her 3 children decades earlier. Detective Chun drove through the quiet residential streets to meet Mrs. Whitman, passing the familiar landmarks of small-town life, the post office with its faded American flag, the corner grocery store where teenagers gathered after school, and the old cemetery where weathered headstones told the stories of families who had called Millbrook home for generations. The Whitman house stood behind a white picket fence, its wraparound porch adorned with hanging baskets of late-season chrysanthemums in deep burgundy and gold dot. Mrs. Whitman met Detective Chun at the front door, her silver hair neatly pinned back and her hands slightly trembling as she gestured toward the interior of her home. She explained that she had awakened around 3 in the morning to use the bathroom and had noticed that the lamp in her living room was on. She distinctly remembered turning it off before going to bed, as she had done every night for the past 40 years. More puzzling still, when she went downstairs to investigate, she found that nothing appeared to be missing. Her purse sat undisturbed on the kitchen counter, her jewelry box remained untouched in the bedroom, and even the small amount of cash she kept in a ceramic jar on her mantelpiece was still there, the only sign that someone had been in the house was the lamp and the faint smell that Mrs. Whitman couldn't quite identify, something like wet leaves and old paper, she said, though she couldn't be certain. Detective Chun walked through each room of the house, taking notes and photographs, checking windows and doors for signs of forced entry. The back door, which opened onto Mrs. Whitman's small garden, showed slight scratches around the lock, but they were so minimal that they could have been there for years. Detective Chun filed the report as a possible break-in, though without any evidence of theft or vandalism, there wasn't much to investigate. She advised Mrs. Whitman to keep her doors locked and to call immediately if anything else unusual happened. The detective drove back through town, past the hardware store where retired men gathered each morning to discuss weather and politics, past the diner where the lunch crowd was beginning to arrive, and filed her report back at the station with little expectation that she would hear about the incident. Again, 3 days later, however, a second call came in. This time it was from Mr. James Patterson, a widower in his 60s who lived on the other side of town on Birch Street. Mr. Patterson worked the early morning shift at the grain elevator just outside town and typically left his house at 4:30 each morning while it was still dark. On Friday morning, as he stepped out his front door, he noticed that his porch light was off. He was certain he had left it on the night before, as he always did during the darker months, to help him navigate his way to his truck. When Detective Chun arrived at the Patterson house, she found a modest ranch-style home with a neat front yard bordered by a chain-link fence. Mr. Patterson, a tall man with calloused hands and work boots worn smooth from years of labor, showed her around his property. Like Mrs. Whitman's house, There were no obvious signs of break-in or theft. Mr. Patterson's wallet, left on his kitchen table, contained the same $43 it had held the night before. His late wife's rings, kept in a small box on his dresser, were undisturbed. The television, an older model but still valuable enough to interest most thieves, sat exactly where it always had in the living room corner, the only unusual detail, Mr. Patterson mentioned almost as an afterthought, was a strange smell he had noticed when he first entered the house after work the previous evening. He described it as musty, like old books or a basement that hadn't been aired out in years. At the time, he had attributed it to the changing weather and the old house's tendency to hold moisture. But now, in light of the porch light incident, he wondered if it might be significant. Detective Chun spent the morning canvassing the neighborhood around Birch Street, knocking on doors and asking residents if they had noticed anything unusual in recent days. Most of the neighbors were elderly retirees or families with young children, and the area was typically quiet after dark. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived directly across from Mr. Patterson, mentioned that she thought she had seen someone walking down the street very late Wednesday night, but she couldn't be sure since she had been watching television and only glimpsed a figure through her peripheral vision. By the following week, 3 more reports had come in, each following the same peculiar pattern. On Sunday night, Mrs. Catherine Mills, a schoolteacher who lived in a small apartment above the flower shop on Main Street, awoke to find that her kitchen faucet was running, though she was certain she had turned it off before bed. On Tuesday, Mr. Dennis Walsh, who owned a small farm on the outskirts of town, discovered that someone had been in his barn during the night, though nothing was missing from among his tools and equipment. On Thursday, the elderly Kowalski brothers, who shared a house on Pine Street, found their front gate standing open in the morning, despite their habit of always securing it before sunset. Each incident shared the same mystifying characteristics: no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen or damaged, and only the faintest evidence that anyone had been present at all. In each case, the affected residents mentioned this same strange, musty odor that seemed to linger in their homes or properties for several hours after the incidents occurred. Detective Chun began to keep a detailed map of the reported break-ins, marking each location with a red pin and noting the dates and times when possible. The pattern that emerged was both intriguing and baffling. The incidents seemed to occur roughly every 2 to 3 days, always during the late night or early morning hours between midnight and 4 a.m. The locations were scattered throughout Millbrook with no obvious geographical connection. The affected properties included houses on different streets, an apartment above a business, and a farm on the town's periphery. The victims varied in age, occupation, and living situation, sharing only their residence in the small town and their bewildering experience of finding evidence that someone had been in their space without any apparent motive. Detective Chun consulted with her partner, Officer Mike Rodriguez, who had grown up in Millbrook and knew the town's history and residents better than anyone else on the small police force. Officer Rodriguez, a thoughtful man in his 40s with a quiet manner and an encyclopedic knowledge of local families and their stories, listened carefully as Detective Chun described the series of incidents. He suggested that they review the town's police records from previous years to see if similar incidents had occurred before, perhaps during the same season or with similar patterns that might provide a clue to understanding the current situation. The Millbrook Police Department's records were kept in a small room behind the main office, filled with filing cabinets that chronicled decades of the town's minor crimes and civil disputes. Detective Chun and Officer Rodriguez spent an entire afternoon going through boxes of reports, looking for anything that resembled the current break-ins. The records painted a picture of a generally peaceful community where the most serious crimes were typically vandalism by teenagers, occasional domestic disputes, and the rare case of theft or fraud. However, buried in the files from October 1998, they found a series of reports that bore a striking resemblance to their current cases. 20 years earlier, during a 3-week period in mid-October, residents throughout Millbrook had reported similar incidents of apparent break-ins with no theft or damage. The 1998 reports described the same puzzling details: no forced entry, nothing missing, strange odors, and minor disturbances like lights being turned on or off, water faucets running, or doors and gates being left open. The incidents had occurred at various locations around town, affecting both longtime residents and relative newcomers, and had stopped as suddenly as they had begun, with no arrests made and no explanation ever determined. Even more intriguing, Officer Rodriguez found a brief mention in the 1998 files of similar incidents reported in 1978, though the records from that time period were less complete. The pattern seemed to suggest that every 20 years, Millbrook experienced this same mysterious wave of unexplained break-ins. Detective Chun felt a chill as she realized that, if the pattern held true, the current incidents might continue for several more weeks before eventually stopping on their own, just as they apparently had in previous decades. Armed with this historical perspective, Detective Chun decided to approach the current investigation differently. Instead of treating each incident as a separate crime, she began to view them as part of a larger pattern that might have a single explanation. She started interviewing longtime residents of Millbrook, particularly those who had lived in town during the previous occurrences in 1998 and possibly even 1978. Many of these conversations took place in the comfortable living rooms of older homes, where residents served coffee and shared their memories of the town's quieter decades. Mrs. Agnes Fletcher, who had lived on Maple Street for 57 years, remembered the 1998 incidents clearly. She described how the whole town had been talking about the break-ins at the time, with neighbors checking on each other more frequently and people being more careful about locking their doors. She recalled that the incidents had seemed to focus on houses and properties that had been in Millbrook for many decades, though she couldn't be certain of this detail. Mrs. Fletcher also mentioned that her late husband had suggested at the time that the break-ins might be connected to the old stories about the town's founding families, though she had never put much stock in such tales. This comment led Detective Chun to research Millbrook's history at the local library, where the current librarian, Ms. Patricia Henley, helped her navigate the collection of local historical documents and newspapers. The library, housed in a beautiful brick building that had served the community since 1892, contained extensive records of the town's development from its founding in 1834 through the present day. Detective Chun spent several evenings after work reading through old newspaper articles, town council minutes, and family histories, looking for any information that might shed light on the recurring pattern of break-ins. Story of Millbrook's founding was fairly typical for small towns in upstate New York. The area had originally been settled by families moving west from New England in search of fertile farmland and opportunities for mill operations along the region's rivers and streams. The town had been named after the Mill Creek that ran through its center, and for its first century, it had thrived as a regional center for grain processing and lumber production. The original founding families, the Millers, the Stones, the Adamses, and the Blackwoods had established most of the town's major businesses and institutions, and their descendants had remained prominent in community affairs for generations. However, Detective Chun discovered that one of these founding families, the Blackwoods, had experienced a mysterious tragedy in the fall of 1858. According to newspaper accounts from that time, the entire Blackwood family, parents Thomas and Mary, along with their 3 children, had disappeared from their home one October night, leaving behind all of their possessions and no indication of where they had gone or why they had left. The disappearance had been investigated by the county sheriff, but no trace of the family was ever found, and their fate remained unknown. The Blackwood House, a large 2-story home that had stood on what was now the corner of Oak Street and 3rd Avenue, had remained empty for several years after the family's disappearance. Eventually, It had been sold to pay debts and taxes, and over the decades, it had changed hands multiple times. According to the historical records, the house had been demolished in 1953 to make room for the small shopping plaza that currently occupied that corner of town. Detective Chun realized that the site of the former Blackwood house was roughly in the center of the area where the recent break-ins had been occurring. This discovery prompted Detective Chun to create a more detailed map of all the break-ins, both recent and historical, in relation to the location of the old Blackwood property. When she plotted all the incidents from 2018, 1998, and 1978 on a single map, a clear pattern emerged. All of the affected properties fell within a rough circle extending about 6 blocks in every direction from the site of the former Blackwood house. Moreover, many of the affected buildings were themselves quite old, dating back to the late 1800s or early 1900s, suggesting a possible connection to the town's early history. Officer Rodriguez, who had been following Detective Chun's research with increasing interest, suggested that they visit some of the oldest residents of Millbrook to ask about local stories or legends that might be connected to the Blackwood family disappearance. This led them to Mr. Walter Kowalski, the elder of the two brothers who had recently experienced one of the break-ins. Mr. Kowalski, who was 86 years old and had lived in Millbrook his entire life, invited them into his living room, where dozens of framed photographs chronicled decades of town history and family gatherings. Mr. Kowalski listened carefully as Kofu. Detective Chun described her research into the town's history and the pattern of break-ins. When she mentioned the Blackwood family, his weathered face took on a thoughtful expression, and he was quiet for several moments before speaking. He explained that his grandfather, who had lived to be nearly 90, had told him stories about the early days of Millbrook, including the mystery of the Blackwood family disappearance. According to these stories, Thomas Blackwood had been known as an unusual man who kept to himself and was rumored to be involved in activities that the other townspeople found suspicious or unsettling. Elder Kowalski had told his grandson that in the weeks before the family's disappearance, several residents had reported seeing strange lights in the Blackwood house at night and hearing unusual sounds coming from the property. Some people had claimed that Thomas Blackwood was involved in some form of occult practices, though this was never proven and may have been simply the result of small-town gossip and superstition. What was certain, according to Mr. Kowalski's grandfather, was that on the night the family disappeared, several neighbors had reported seeing multiple figures walking through the town streets in the early morning hours. Though these sightings were never officially investigated, Mr. Kowalski also shared a detail that wasn't in any of the official records Detective Chun had found. His grandfather had claimed that every 20 years or so, usually in October, residents throughout Millbrook would report strange incidents, doors and windows found open, lights turned on or off, and the feeling that someone had been in their homes during the night. The older residents had attributed these occurrences to the restless spirits of the Blackwood family, still searching for something they had left behind when they disappeared. While Mr. Kowalski himself didn't necessarily believe in such supernatural explanations, he admitted that the timing and nature of the current break-in seemed remarkably consistent with his grandfather's stories. Detective Chun thanked Mr. Kowalski for sharing these family memories and returned to the police station with a wealth of new information to consider. While she remained skeptical of supernatural explanations for the break-ins, she couldn't ignore the strong historical pattern that seemed to connect the current incidents to events that had occurred in Millbrook for more than a century. She decided to focus her investigation on finding a more concrete explanation for the 20-year cycle of break-ins, even if that explanation might be unconventional. Working with Officer Rodriguez, Detective Chun began to research whether anyone currently living in Millbrook might have access to information about the historical break-ins and might be deliberately recreating them for unknown reasons. They created a list of residents who had lived in town during both the 1998 and 2018 incidents, focusing particularly on people who might have had access to the police records or historical documents that detailed the previous occurrences. They also began to pay closer attention to the timing and location of the incidents, looking for any patterns that might suggest human planning rather than random occurrence. Over the next 2 weeks, as October progressed and the autumn air grew crisp and cold, the break-ins continued to occur with the same puzzling regularity. Mrs. Dorothy Brennan, who lived in a cottage behind the Methodist church, awoke one morning to find that someone had rearranged the furniture in her living room, moving chairs and tables just a few inches from their normal positions. Mr. Carl Jensen discovered that the gate to his backyard had been left open, and that someone had walked through his vegetable garden, leaving barely visible footprints in the soft soil between the rows of winter squash and Brussels sprouts. Each new incident added to the growing sense of unease that had settled over Millbrook like the morning fog that rose from the creek each dawn. Residents began checking on their elderly neighbors more frequently, and hardware store owner Bill Murphy reported increased sales of door locks and motion sensor lights. The local diner became a gathering place where townspeople shared their theories and concerns about the mysterious break-ins, with conversations ranging from speculation about transient criminals to half-serious discussions of the old stories about the Blackwood family. Detective Chun found herself working longer hours, driven by both professional duty and personal fascination with the case. She had grown up in a larger city where crimes typically had clear motives and logical explanations, and the puzzle of Millbrook's break-ins challenged her assumptions about criminal behavior. She began to spend her evenings driving slowly through the town's quiet streets, looking for anything unusual and trying to understand the pattern from the perspective of whoever was responsible for the incidents. On the night of October 23rd, Detective Chun decided to stake out the area around the former site of the Blackwood house, positioning herself in her unmarked patrol car, where she could observe several of the streets where break-ins had occurred. The night was cold and clear, with a three-quarter moon providing enough light to see movement in the residential areas. She had brought a thermos of coffee and settled in for what she expected to be a long, possibly uneventful watch. Around 2:30 in the morning, Detective Chun noticed movement in the shadows near the intersection of Oak Street and 3rd Avenue. A figure appeared to be walking slowly along the sidewalk, stopping occasionally to look at the houses and properties along the street. The person was too far away for Detective Chun to identify clearly, but their movement seemed deliberate and purposeful rather than random. She started her car and slowly drove closer, trying to get a better view without alerting the individual to her presence. As she approached, the figure seemed to sense her presence and quickly disappeared between two houses, moving with surprising speed and familiarity with the terrain. Detective Chun parked her car and followed on foot, using her flashlight to search the yards and alleys where the person had vanished. She found fresh footprints in the soft earth of a flower bed and followed them toward the back of one of the houses, but the trail disappeared on the paved surface of a rear alley. Frustrated but encouraged by this first direct sighting of someone who might be connected to the break-ins, Detective Chen expanded her surveillance efforts over the following nights. She coordinated with Officer Rodriguez and the 2 other full-time officers on the small police force to maintain periodic watches throughout the affected area. They also asked the county sheriff's department to provide occasional backup patrols during the late-night hours when the incidents typically occurred. 3 nights later, Officer Rodriguez reported a similar sighting near Pine Street, where he observed someone moving between houses around 3 in the morning. Like Detective Chun's experience, the figure had disappeared quickly when approached, leaving behind only faint traces of their presence. However, Officer Rodriguez was able to provide a more detailed description. A person of average height wearing dark clothing, moving with confidence through yards and alleys as if familiar with the neighborhood. Layout, the partial descriptions and sighting patterns led Detective Chun to focus her attention on current residents of Millbrook who would have intimate knowledge of the town's geography and who might have lived there during previous cycles of break-ins. She began to interview longtime residents more systematically, asking not only about their memories of past incidents, but also about their current daily routines and whether they had noticed anything unusual about their neighbors' behavior in recent weeks. During one of these interviews, Mrs. Helen Carmichael, who had lived on Elm Street for 32 years, mentioned that she had recently noticed unusual activity at the old Hendricks place, a small house at the end of her street that had been empty for several months. The house had belonged to Mr. Robert Hendricks, a reclusive man who had lived alone and had died the previous spring at the age of 78. His estate was still being settled by distant relatives, and the house had remained vacant and mostly forgotten by the community. Mrs. Carmichael explained that over the past few weeks, she had occasionally seen lights in the windows of the Hendricks house late at night, though she had assumed that the relatives or a real estate agent were checking on the property. However, given the recent break-ins and the general atmosphere of unease in town, she had begun to wonder if someone might be using the empty house without permission. Detective Chun immediately drove to Elm Street to examine the Hendricks house. The small, well-maintained home sat on a corner lot surrounded by overgrown hedges that provided privacy from the street. A for sale sign stood in the front yard, slightly tilted and weathered from weeks of autumn rain. Detective Chun walked around the perimeter of the property, looking for signs of unauthorized entry or occupation down at the back of the house. She discovered that one of the basement windows had been carefully pried open, with the glass intact but the frame slightly damaged. The window was large enough for a person to climb through, and there were scuff marks on the exterior wall, suggesting that someone had indeed used this entrance. Detective Chun called for backup and waited for Officer Rodriguez to arrive before entering the house to investigate. Inside the Hendricks house, Detective Chun and Officer Rodriguez found clear evidence that someone had been living in the basement for an extended period. A sleeping bag and pillow were arranged in one corner, along with a small camping stove, several canned goods, and a battery-powered lantern. A stack of books sat nearby, including volumes on local history and what appeared to be hand-copied notes about Millbrook's founding families. Most significantly, they found a detailed map of the town with pins marking the locations of all the recent break-ins, along with additional markings that corresponded to the historical incidents from 1998 and 1978. Among the personal items in the makeshift living space, Detective Chun found identification belonging to David Hendricks, the 34-year-old grandson of the house's former owner. According to the documents, David had been living in Portland, Oregon, and had returned to Millbrook to handle his grandfather's estate after the old man's death. However, rather than staying in a hotel or with other family members, he had apparently been secretly living in the basement of his grandfather's empty house. Further investigation revealed that David Hendricks had grown up in Millbrook and had lived with his grandfather for several years during his teenage period. After his parents' divorce, he would have been 14 years old during the 1998 break-ins and would have heard the local stories and speculation about the historical pattern of incidents. The books and notes found in the basement suggested that he had been researching the town's history extensively, particularly the story of the Blackwood family disappearance and its possible connection to the recurring break-ins. Detective Chun and Officer Rodriguez set up surveillance of the Hendricks house and waited for David to return. They didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, a figure approached the house from the rear alley, moving carefully through the shadows and clearly familiar with the property's layout. Detective Chun and Officer Rodriguez positioned themselves to observe the individual's entry into the house through the basement window, and then approached to make contact. David Hendricks was a thin, pale man with unkempt hair and clothes that suggested he had been living rough for some time. When confronted by the officers, he didn't attempt to flee or resist, but instead seemed almost relieved to finally be discovered. Detective Chun read him his rights and transported him to the police station for questioning, while Officer Rodriguez secured the basement room and collected the evidence they had found. During the interview that followed, David Hendricks provided a full confession to the series of break-ins, though his explanation was far different from what Detective Chun had expected. He explained that he had returned to Millbrook 6 weeks earlier to settle his grandfather's estate, but had found himself deeply affected by returning to the town where he had spent some of his most difficult teenage years. His grandfather had been a local history enthusiast who had collected stories and documents about Millbrook's past, and David had become fascinated by the recurring pattern of mysterious incidents that seemed to happen every 20 years. David admitted that he had initially broken into houses out of curiosity, wanting to see if he could recreate the historical incidents and perhaps understand what had really happened during the previous cycles. He had been careful never to steal anything or cause damage, instead leaving only subtle signs of his presence as a way of testing whether the current residents would react the same way people had in 1998 and 1978. As he continued the break-ins, he had become increasingly convinced that he was fulfilling some kind of historical destiny, carrying on a tradition that connected him to the deeper mysteries of the town's past. The psychological evaluation that followed revealed that David had been struggling with depression and feelings of disconnection since his grandfather's death. His return to Millbrook had triggered memories of his troubled teenage years, and his obsession with the historical break-ins had become a way of feeling connected to something larger than his own personal problems. The psychiatrist who examined him concluded that while David's behavior had been illegal and disturbing to the community, it had been driven more by mental health issues and grief than by any criminal intent. Detective Chun spent considerable time with David during the investigation, trying to understand his motivations and the extent of his knowledge about the town's history. He shared copies of his grandfather's notes and historical research, which included detailed accounts of the previous break-in cycles that weren't available in the official police records. According to these family documents, David's grandfather had believed that the incidents were connected to items or documents that the Blackwood family had hidden in various houses around town before their disappearance in 1858. The elder Hendricks had theorized that every 20 years, someone who knew the family's story would attempt to search for these hidden items, either out of curiosity about the historical mystery or belief that the items might be valuable. He had suggested that the pattern of break-ins represented different individuals across different generations who had become obsessed with solving the puzzle of the Blackwood disappearance. David's grandfather had even speculated that his own grandson might someday become interested in the mystery, given his childhood fascination with local ghost stories and historical puzzles. This revelation provided Detective Chen with a rational explanation for the 20-year cycle of break-ins. Rather than being connected to supernatural forces or the restless spirits of the disappeared family, the incidents were likely the result of different individuals across different generations who had become aware of the historical pattern and had decided to investigate it personally. Each person had probably believed that they might succeed where previous searchers had failed, and each had eventually stopped their activities either because they lost interest, were caught, or moved away from the town. David Hendricks was ultimately charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering, but given his cooperation with the investigation and his obvious mental health issues, he was sentenced to community service and mandatory counseling rather than jail time. The judge who handled his case noted that his actions, while illegal, had not been motivated by criminal intent and that he had taken care not to steal or damage property during his break-ins. David agreed to leave Millbrook and return to Oregon, where he would be closer to family members who could provide support during his recovery. In the weeks following David's arrest, the break-ins in Millbrook stopped completely, and the town gradually returned to its normal quiet routine. Detective Chen filed a comprehensive report that documented not only the recent incidents, but also the historical pattern that had apparently driven them. She recommended that the police department maintain awareness of the 20-year cycle and be prepared for possible similar incidents around 2038, should another individual become obsessed with the town's mysterious history. The case became something of a legend within the small police department, and Detective Chun found herself thinking about it often during the quiet winter months that followed. The investigation had revealed the power of local history and storytelling to influence behavior across generations, and had demonstrated how unresolved mysteries could capture the imagination of individuals who felt disconnected from their communities or their own lives. Officer Rodriguez, who had grown up listening to stories about the Blackwood family and the periodic strange incidents in town, reflected on how the case had shown that some mysteries persist not because they can't be solved, but because each generation finds new meaning in the questions they pose. The truth about what happened to the Blackwood family in 1858 would probably never be known, but the story would continue to be told, and perhaps in another 20 years, someone else would become curious enough about the old mystery to begin their own investigation. Detective Shun transferred to a larger city department the following year, but she kept copies of all the case files and historical documents from the Millbrook investigation. The case had taught her important lessons about the role of community history in shaping present-day behavior, and about the need to look beyond obvious explanations when investigating patterns of unusual criminal activity. She would sometimes share the story with fellow officers as an example of how local knowledge and historical research could be crucial tools in solving seemingly inexplicable cases. Town of Millbrook settled back into its peaceful rhythm, with residents gradually forgetting about the strange weeks in October when they had worried about mysterious intruders and checked their locks more carefully before bed. The hardware store's sales of security equipment returned to normal levels, and the diner conversations moved on to other topics. Mrs. Whitman continued to turn off her living room lamp each night before bed, and Mr. Patterson kept his porch light burning until dawn. But these became simply normal parts of their daily routines rather than responses to fear or uncertainty. The Hendricks house was eventually sold to a young family who moved to Millbrook for the quiet, small-town atmosphere and good schools for their children. They renovated the basement and turned it into a family room, never knowing that it had once been the headquarters for a months-long investigation into the town's most persistent historical mystery. The new owners planted flowers in the backyard and installed a swing set, and the house once again became a normal part of the neighborhood's domestic landscape. As autumn returned to Millbrook the following year, the changing leaves and cooling air brought with them only the usual seasonal concerns about heating bills and snow removal. The anniversary of the break-ins passed without incident, and most residents had moved on to more immediate worries and interests. Detective Chun's replacement, a young officer fresh from the State Police Academy, read through the case files as part of his orientation, but found it difficult to believe that such a quiet, peaceful town had ever been the scene of any criminal activity, mysterious or otherwise. In the end, the case of the Millbrook break-ins became another layer in the town's ongoing story, a chapter that would be remembered by some residents and forgotten by others, but that would remain part of the community's collective memory. The police department kept Detective Chun's detailed files and historical research, and somewhere in those documents lay the seeds of understanding for whatever investigator might need them. Should the 20-year cycle ever bring another curious seeker to the quiet streets of Millbrook in the autumn nights of some future October, mystery of the Blackwood family remained unsolved, as it had for more than a century and a half. But the town had learned something valuable about itself through the investigation of the recent break-ins. Millbrook's residents had discovered that their community's history was deeper and more complex than many had realized, and that the past could continue to influence the present in unexpected ways. The story of the break-ins had brought neighbors together, encouraged people to look out for one another, and reminded everyone that even in the quietest small towns, mysteries could unfold that challenged assumptions about safety, privacy, and the nature of community life. As winter settled over the town and snow began to dust the sidewalks and rooftops, Millbrook returned to the peaceful rhythm that had characterized it for most of its long history. The creek that gave the town its name continued to flow through the center of the community, carrying with it the memories and stories of all the people who had called this place home. And somewhere in the quiet corners of houses and businesses throughout the town, the items and documents that the Blackwood family may or may not have hidden continued to wait, patient and silent, for whatever future seeker might come looking for the answers to questions that had puzzled the community for generations. Asterisk. Tonight, we journey to the outskirts of Riverside, a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, where the autumn rains of 2019 brought renewed attention to an abandoned train station that had stood empty for nearly 4 decades. The station, built of weathered brick and timber in the 1920s, sat beside the Cascade River where the old freight line once carried lumber and grain from the rural valleys to the larger cities along the coast. The building had been decommissioned in 1982 when the railroad company consolidated its operations, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of what had once been a bustling hub of commerce and travel. Detective Maria Santos had been with the Riverside Police Department for 12 years when the first unusual report came in on a gray October morning. The rain fell steadily against the windows of the police station, creating rivulets that traced irregular paths down the glass like the slow passage of years across an old building's facade. The caller was Mr. Frank Morrison, a retired engineer who lived in a small house about half a mile from the abandoned station, and who had developed the habit of taking long walks along the river path during his morning routine. Mr. Morrison explained to Detective Santos that for the past several weeks, he had been noticing signs of activity around the old train station during his early morning walks. At first, he had attributed these observations to maintenance work or perhaps preparations for the demolition that city officials had been discussing for years. However, the activity seemed to occur only during the very early morning hours, before dawn, and he had never seen any official vehicles or work crews in the area during daylight hours. Detective Santos drove through the residential neighborhoods that bordered the industrial section where the train station stood, passing modest homes with well-tended gardens and the small businesses that served the working class, families who had made this part of Riverside their home for generations. The morning air carried the scent of wet leaves and the distant smell of the river, which ran high and swift with the autumn rains that fed the region's countless streams and tributaries. The abandoned train station sat on a lot surrounded by chain-link fencing that had been installed years earlier to keep vandals and curious teenagers away from the deteriorating structure. However, Detective Santos could see that sections of the fence had been cut and repaired multiple times, and that well-worn paths led from the river trail to various points around the building's perimeter. The station itself was a 2-story structure with a distinctive peaked roof and large windows that had been boarded up with weathered plywood, giving the building the appearance of a sleeping giant with closed eyes. Mr. Morrison met Detective Santos at the main gate to the fenced area, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the kind of sturdy walking shoes that suggested decades of daily exercise, regardless of weather. He was a tall, lean man in his 70s with silver hair and the careful manner of someone accustomed to paying attention to details and mechanical systems. He had worked for the railroad for 38 years before his retirement and had actually been stationed at this very facility during its final years of operation in the early 1980s. As they walked around the perimeter of the station, Mr. Morrison pointed out the various signs of recent activity that had caught his attention. Fresh footprints were visible in the mud near several gaps in the fence, and there were areas where the tall weeds had been trampled down as if people had been walking through them regularly. Most puzzling of all, he had noticed light emanating from inside the building on several occasions, visible through small gaps in the boarded-up windows. Though there had been no electrical service to the station for decades, Detective Santos examined the building more closely, looking for signs of forced entry or unauthorized occupation. The main entrance was secured with a heavy padlock that showed no signs of tampering, but around the back of the building, she found a loading dock where one of the large doors had been pried open, just enough to allow a person to slip inside. The damage was relatively fresh, with clean wood visible where the doorframe had been splintered, suggesting that the break-in had occurred within the past few weeks. Before entering the building, Detective Santos called for backup and waited for Officer Thomas Kim, her regular partner, to arrive at the scene. Officer Kim had been with the department for 8 years and had grown up in Riverside, giving him intimate knowledge of the city's forgotten corners and abandoned places. He also brought with him a portable radio and flashlights, knowing that the interior of the abandoned station would be dark and potentially dangerous. After years of neglect, the interior of the train station revealed itself slowly as Detective Santos and Officer Kim made their way through the building with their flashlights cutting through the dusty air. The main waiting area was a large, high-ceilinged room with ticket windows along one wall and wooden benches that had once provided seating for travelers waiting for their trains. Decades of abandonment had left the space filled with debris, fallen plaster, and the gradual accumulation of leaves and other material that had blown in through broken windows and damaged sections of the roof. However, it was immediately clear that someone had been using the building recently. A section of the waiting area had been cleared of debris, and several pieces of camping furniture, folding chairs, and a small table had been arranged in a rough circle. Battery-powered lanterns provided the light source that Mr. Morrison had observed from outside, and extension cords suggested that someone had brought in a portable generator to power additional equipment. More intriguingly, the walls of the cleared area were covered with dozens of photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes that appeared to document various events and people connected to the history of the train station and the surrounding area. The photographs ranged from historical images of the station during its operational years to more recent pictures of the building in its abandoned state. Many of the newspaper clippings were yellowed with age and appeared to date from the 1970s and early 1980s, during the period when the station was being phased out of service. Detective Santos and Officer Kim spent considerable time examining this improvised display, trying to understand the purpose and meaning of the collection. The historical photographs showed the station during its busiest years, with trains arriving and departing, workers loading freight, and passengers waiting with their luggage and families. The more recent images seemed to focus on the fire, building's deterioration, and the various attempts by city officials and community groups to find new uses for the property. The newspaper clippings told a more complex story. Many of them reported on accidents and incidents that had occurred at the station during its final years of operation. There had been several derailments caused by track maintenance issues, workplace accidents involving freight handlers, and at least one incident where a transient had been found dead in one of the unused sections of the building during a particularly harsh winter. The articles painted a picture of a facility that had been struggling with safety and maintenance problems during its decline, and that had been the site of several tragedies before its eventual closure. Among the handwritten notes, Detective Santos found what appeared to be research into the fates of specific individuals who had worked at the station or had been involved in the various incidents reported in the newspaper clippings. Someone had been tracking down information about former employees, accident victims, and their families, creating detailed timelines and family trees that connected these people to the history of the station and the broader community. Officer Kim discovered additional evidence of long-term occupation in the station's former office areas. Several rooms on the second floor had been cleaned and furnished with sleeping bags, camping equipment, and supplies that suggested someone had been living in the building for an extended period. A makeshift kitchen had been set up in what had once been the station master's office, complete with a camping stove, cooler, and stocks of non-perishable food. Personal belongings were scattered throughout these rooms, including clothing, books, and electronic devices that were being powered by a small, quiet generator hidden in a storage closet. The most significant discovery came when Detective Santos found a journal hidden beneath one of the sleeping bags. The journal contained months of entries written in a careful, precise handwriting that documented the authors' research into the history of the train station and their growing obsession with what they described as the unfinished business of the people who had worked and died there. The entries revealed that the author had been living in the station since late spring, using it as a base for their investigation into what they believed were unresolved deaths and accidents that had been covered up or inadequately investigated by the authorities at the time. The journal's author identified himself as Robert Chun, a former investigative journalist who had become convinced that the railroad company and local officials had concealed the true causes of several fatal accidents at the station during the 1970s and early 1980s. According to his writings, Chun believed that cost-cutting measures and safety violations had led to preventable deaths, and that the families of the victims had never received adequate compensation or answers about what had really happened to their loved ones. Chun's entries described his efforts to track down surviving family members, former employees, and anyone else who might have information about the accidents and incidents that had occurred at the station. He had been conducting interviews, reviewing old corporate records, and trying to piece together a comprehensive picture of what he saw as a pattern of corporate negligence and official cover-ups. The journal revealed that he had been working on this investigation for more than 2 years, and that his residence in the abandoned station was both a practical measure to save money and a symbolic gesture to honor the memory of those who had died there. Detective Santos recognized the name Robert Chun from her review of recent missing persons reports. Chun had been reported missing by his sister 3 months earlier, after he had failed to return to his apartment in Portland and had stopped responding to phone calls and emails. The missing person report indicated that Chun had a history of depression and had been struggling financially since losing his job at a newspaper that had closed down due to budget cuts. His sister had been concerned that he might harm himself or might have become involved in a dangerous situation while pursuing one of his freelance investigations. Armed with this information, Detective Santos and Officer Kim expanded their search of the train station to look for any signs that Robert Chun might still be in the area or might have left behind clues about his current whereabouts. They found additional personal belongings that confirmed his identity, including identification documents and correspondence with family members. However, there were no signs that anyone had been in the building recently, and the supplies and equipment appeared to have been undisturbed. For several weeks, the investigation took on greater urgency as Detective Santos realized that Robert Chun might be in danger, either from his own mental health struggles or from external threats related to his investigation. She began reviewing the specific accidents and incidents that Chun had been researching, looking for any information that might explain his disappearance or provide leads about where he might have gone. The case files from the 1970s and early 1980s revealed a troubling pattern of accidents and safety violations at the train station. Between 1976 and 1981, there had been 7 serious accidents at the facility, including 3 fatalities and multiple serious injuries. The accidents had included derailments caused by faulty switches, injuries from defective loading equipment, and exposure incidents involving hazardous chemicals that were being transported through the facility without proper safety precautions. Each of these accidents had been investigated by various agencies, including the railroad's own safety department, state transportation officials, and federal regulators. However, the investigation reports suggested that the inquiries had been perfunctory and that little effort had been made to determine whether the accidents were part of a broader pattern of negligence. In several cases, the families of victims had filed lawsuits against the railroad company, but these suits had been settled out of court with confidentiality agreements that prevented the details from becoming public. Detective Santos began contacting the families of accident victims to ask whether Robert Chun had been in touch with them during his investigation. This led to a series of emotional conversations with people who had lost loved ones decades earlier and who had never received satisfactory answers about the circumstances of those deaths. Many of these family members confirmed that Chun had contacted them within the past year, asking detailed questions about the accidents and expressing his belief that the truth about what had happened had been deliberately concealed. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, whose husband had been killed in a 1978 derailment, told Detective Santos that Chen had visited her at her home 6 months earlier. He had brought with him copies of internal railroad documents that he claimed showed that company officials had known about track maintenance problems, but had delayed repairs to save money. According to Mrs. Kellerman, Chun had been passionate and convincing in his presentation of the evidence, and had promised to help her pursue legal action against the railroad company if he could gather additional proof of negligence. Similar conversations with other family members revealed that Chun had been building a comprehensive case against the railroad company, collecting documents, testimony, and expert analysis that he believed would prove that corporate negligence had been responsible for multiple preventable deaths. Several family members mentioned that Chun had seemed increasingly agitated and paranoid during his recent contacts with them, expressing concerns that he was being followed or that his investigation was being sabotaged by powerful interests. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Detective Santos received a call from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. A hiker had discovered what appeared to be a campsite along the river about 2 miles upstream from the abandoned train station. The campsite included camping gear, personal belongings, and documents that suggested a connection to Robert Chun's investigation. However, there was no sign of Chun himself, and the condition of the campsite suggested that it had been abandoned for several weeks. Detective Santos and Officer Kim hiked to the Riverside campsite with sheriff's deputies and a search and rescue team. The site was located in a secluded area where the river curved through a small canyon, providing natural shelter and privacy from the hiking trails and roads that crossed the area. The campsite was well organized and showed signs of long-term occupation, with a sturdy tent, cooking equipment, and supplies that would have allowed someone to live there for an extended period. Among the belongings at the campsite, the officers found additional copies of Robert Chun's research materials, including documents that weren't present at the train station. These materials included what appeared to be copies of internal railroad company communications from the 1970s and early 1980s, including memos and reports that discussed the safety problems at the station and the company's decisions to delay repairs and improvements. The documents suggested that Chen had gained access to information that had not been available to the original investigators or to the families of accident victims. More concerning were handwritten notes that indicated Chun had been in contact with someone who claimed to have additional information about the cover-up of the train station accidents. The notes referenced meetings with a former railroad employee who had agreed to provide testimony about the company's safety violations, but who had apparently become afraid to come forward publicly. The most recent entry suggested that Chun had been planning to meet with this person at a location that wasn't specified in the notes that were found at the campsite. The search and rescue team conducted an extensive search of the area around the campsite, looking for any signs that Chun might have become lost or injured while hiking in the rugged terrain along the river. However, after 2 days of searching with dogs and helicopter support, they found no trace of Chun or any evidence that he had been in the area recently. The condition of the campsite and the personal belongings suggested that it had been abandoned suddenly, possibly under circumstances that had prevented Chun from returning. To collect his research materials and equipment, Detective Santos expanded the investigation to include inquiries into Chun's sources of information and his contacts within the railroad industry. This led to the discovery that Chun had been in communication with several former employees of the railroad company, including some who had worked at the train station during the period when the accidents had occurred. Many of these individuals were reluctant to speak with police, expressing concerns about potential retaliation or legal consequences for discussing their former employer's business practices. However, one former employee, Harold Martinez, agreed to meet with Detective Santos at a coffee shop in downtown Riverside. Martinez had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the train station from 1975 to 1982 and had been present during several of the accidents that Chun had been investigating. He was a soft-spoken man in his 70s who had been deeply affected by the deaths and injuries he had witnessed during his years at the station. Martinez confirmed many of the details that Chun had uncovered in his research, including the company's practice of deferring maintenance and safety improvements to reduce costs. He explained that workers at the station had repeatedly raised concerns about dangerous conditions, but that their reports had been ignored or dismissed by management. Martinez also revealed that after the most serious accidents, company officials had pressured employees to sign statements that minimized the safety problems and supported the official explanations for what had happened. Most importantly, Martinez told Detective Santos that Robert Chun had contacted him several times over the past year, asking for detailed information about the accidents and requesting copies of any documents or records that Martinez might have kept from his time at the station. Martinez had been impressed by Chun's dedication to uncovering the truth and had agreed to provide him with internal company documents that he had saved over the years, including maintenance reports and safety memos that contradicted the company's public statements about the accidents. Martinez revealed that he had agreed to meet with Chun one final time to provide him with additional documents that he believed would conclusively prove the railroad company's negligence. This meeting had been scheduled for early September, at a location along the river where they would be unlikely to be observed or overheard. However, Chun had failed to appear for this meeting, and Martinez had not heard from him since that time. This information provided Detective Santos with a potential timeline for Chun's disappearance and suggested that he might have encountered some kind of trouble while traveling to or from his planned meeting with Martinez. She organized additional search efforts focused on the area where the meeting was supposed to have taken place, which was located several miles downstream from Chun's Riverside campsite. Search team found evidence of recent activity at the designated meeting location, including tire tracks from a vehicle that had been parked beside the river access road and footprints that suggested at least 2 people had been present at the site. However, there were no signs of a struggle or any indication of what might have happened to Robert Chun after he arrived for his meeting with Martinez. Detective Santos began to investigate the possibility that Chun's research had attracted the attention of people who wanted to prevent him from publicizing his findings about the train station accidents. She contacted the current management of the railroad company, which had been purchased by a larger corporation in the 1990s, to ask about their knowledge of Chun's investigation and whether they had taken any action to protect themselves from potential legal liability. The railroad company's legal department initially claimed no knowledge of Chun's investigation or his research into the historical accidents at the train station. However, further inquiry revealed that the company had recently hired a private investigation firm to look into potential threats to their business, including journalists and activists who might be pursuing litigation or negative publicity related to the company's historical practices. This discovery led Detective Santos to contact the private investigation firm to ask about their activities related to Robert Chun. The firm's representatives were reluctant to discuss their work, citing client confidentiality, but they eventually acknowledged that they had been monitoring Chun's activities and had prepared reports about his investigation for their client. They denied any involvement in Chun's disappearance and claimed that their work had been limited to information gathering and legal research. However, one of the private investigators, speaking confidentially, told Detective Santos that the firm had been concerned about the quality and accuracy of Chun's research. According to this source, Chun had uncovered legitimate evidence of safety violations and cover-ups, and his investigation posed a real threat to the railroad company's reputation and financial interests. The private investigator suggested that there were people within the company who might have been willing to take more aggressive action to prevent Chun from publishing his findings. As winter approached, and the search for Robert Chun continued without success, Detective Santos began to focus on the possibility that he had chosen to disappear voluntarily, either out of fear for his safety or frustration with his inability to bring his investigation to a successful conclusion. Chun's journal entries from the train station had revealed a man who was becoming increasingly isolated and paranoid, and his sister had confirmed that he had been struggling with depression and financial problems. The case remained open but inactive through the winter months, with periodic checks of Chun's known associates and locations where he might have sought shelter. Detective Santos maintained contact with the family members of train station accident victims, several of whom expressed their hope that Chun's research would eventually be completed and published, even if Chen himself was never found. In early spring, the case took an unexpected turn when a construction crew working on river flood control projects discovered human remains at a location about 5 miles downstream from the train station. The remains were found wedged against a log jam in a section of the river that was rarely visited by hikers or fishermen, and the condition of the site suggested that they had been in the water for several months. Dental records confirmed that the remains were those of Robert Chun, and the medical examiner determined that he had drowned, though the circumstances of his death could not be definitively established. There was no evidence of trauma or foul play, but it was also impossible to determine whether his death had been accidental or intentional. The location where his body was found was consistent with him having entered the water somewhere upstream, possibly at the location where he was supposed to meet Harold Martinez. Detective Santos concluded her investigation with the assumption that Robert Chun had died accidentally while traveling to or from his meeting with the former railroad employee. The rocky terrain along the river and the swift current during the autumn flood season would have made it easy for someone to slip and fall, especially if they were walking in darkness or unfamiliar conditions. Chun's history of depression raised the possibility of suicide, but there was no evidence to support this conclusion, and his journal entries suggested that he had been hopeful about completing his investigation. The research materials that Chun had assembled during his investigation were eventually turned over to his sister, who consulted with attorneys about the possibility of pursuing legal action against the railroad company. However, the statute of limitations had expired on most of the potential claims, and the confidentiality agreements that had been signed by accident victims' families decades earlier made it difficult to use Chun's evidence in court. The abandoned train station continued to stand beside the river, its boarded windows and crumbling walls gradually being reclaimed by the vegetation that grew along the water's edge. City officials eventually decided to demolish the building and convert the site into a small riverside park, with a memorial plaque that acknowledged the workers who had died in accidents at the facility during its years of operation. Harold Martinez, the former maintenance supervisor who had been Chun's final contact, attended the dedication ceremony for the memorial. He spoke briefly about the men who had died at the station and about the importance of remembering their sacrifice and ensuring that their deaths had not been in vain. He didn't mention Robert Chun by name, but those who had followed the investigation understood the connection between Chun's work and the decision to finally acknowledge the station's tragic history. Detective Santos transferred to the department's cold case unit the following year, where she continued to review unsolved cases and to look for patterns and connections that might have been missed during the original investigations. The Robert Chun case had taught her important lessons about the persistence of injustice and the lengths to which people would go to uncover the truth about historical wrongs. She kept copies of Chun's research materials in her personal files, knowing that someday another investigator might find them useful in pursuing similar cases of corporate negligence and cover-ups. The river continued to flow past the site where the train station had once stood, carrying with it the memory of the men who had died there and the man who had devoted his final months to ensuring that their stories would not be forgotten. The autumn rains returned each year, swelling the river and washing away the traces of human activity along its banks. But the questions that Robert Chun had raised about justice and accountability remained as persistent as the water that carved its path through the landscape. In the end, the case of the abandoned train station became another chapter in the ongoing story of how the past continues to influence the present, and how the search for truth can consume those who pursue it with too much passion and too little support. The building was gone, but the memories of what had happened, there lived on in the hearts of those who had been touched by tragedy, and in the research notes of a man who had given his life, trying to bring justice to the forgotten victims of corporate indifference. The investigation had revealed that sometimes the most important discoveries are made not in courtrooms or newspaper headlines, but in the quiet moments when someone chooses to remember the dead and to honor their memory by refusing to let their stories disappear into the silence of history. Robert Chun had found the truth he was looking for, even if he had not lived to see it acknowledged or acted upon, and his work had ensured that the victims of the train station accidents would be remembered long after the building itself had been reduced to rubble and memories. Tonight, we venture to Millfield, a rural village in the rolling farmland of southern Ohio, where the winter of 2020 brought to light a series of forgotten police files that would puzzle investigators and residents alike. The village, home to fewer than 800 souls, sat nestled among fields of corn and soybeans that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Main Street consisted of a single block of weathered storefronts, a small post office, and the Millfield Community Center that served as the heart of village life for generations of farming families who had made this quiet corner of the Kukutaya countryside their home. Detective Lovra Williams had recently joined the newly consolidated county police force when she was assigned to review cold case files from the various small departments that had been merged into the larger organization. The process of consolidation had brought together records from a dozen rural communities, creating a massive archive of unsolved cases, forgotten reports, and administrative documents that needed to be cataloged and digitized. Detective Williams, who had transferred from a city department in Columbus, found herself spending long winter afternoons in a converted warehouse, sorting through boxes of files that told the stories of crimes and mysteries spanning more than 50 years of rural law enforcement. Was during one of these archival sessions, with snow falling steadily outside the warehouse windows and space heaters humming to keep the large room comfortable, that Detective Williams discovered a manila folder labeled Millfield Missing Property Reports, 1995 to 2005. The folder contained more than 40 separate reports, each documenting the disappearance of personal belongings from homes throughout the small village. What made these reports unusual was not their number, but their consistency and the peculiar nature of the items that had gone missing. Unlike typical theft cases, where criminals targeted valuable items like electronics, jewelry, or cash, the Millfield reports described the disappearance of seemingly random personal belongings with little monetary value. Family photographs had vanished from mantelpieces, children's toys had disappeared from bedrooms, books had been taken from shelves, and personal letters had gone missing from desks and drawers. In many cases, the missing items had significant sentimental value to their owners, but would have been worthless to anyone else. Detective Williams spread the reports across a folding table and began to look for patterns in the dates, locations, and types of items that had been stolen. The reports spanned a 10-year period from 1995 to 2005, with incidents occurring throughout all seasons and affecting households across the village without regard to income, family size, or social status. The Millfield Police Department, which had consisted of a single part-time officer during this period, had investigated each report individually, but had never identified any suspects or recovered any of the missing items. The first report, dated March 15, 1995, came from Mrs. Ruth Henderson, who had discovered that a framed photograph of her late husband was missing from her bedroom dresser. The photograph, taken on their wedding day in 1952, had sat in the same location for more than 40 years and was the only picture she had of her husband in his army uniform. Mrs. Henderson had searched her entire house multiple times and had questioned her adult children and grandchildren, but no one could explain how the photograph had disappeared. Officer Jim Murphy, who had handled the initial investigation, had found no signs of forced entry into Mrs. Henderson's home. All doors and windows were secure, and nothing else appeared to be missing from the house. Mrs. Henderson lived alone and was certain that she had locked all her doors before going to bed, as was her lifelong habit. The incident had deeply upset her, not because of any monetary loss, but because the photograph represented her most treasured connection to her deceased husband's memory. Similar reports followed with disturbing regularity throughout 1995. In May, the Walsh family discovered that their daughter's favorite stuffed animal had vanished from her bedroom while the family was attending Sunday morning church services. The toy, a well-worn teddy bear that 8-year-old Emma Walsh had owned since infancy, was found neither in the house nor anywhere on the family's property. The little girl was inconsolable, and the family spent days searching every possible location where the bear might have been misplaced. In August, Mr. Carl Brennan reported that a wooden jewelry box that had belonged to his late mother was missing from his bedroom. The box contained no valuable jewelry, only a collection of costume pieces and a few items of sentimental value that his mother had treasured. Like the other incidents, there were no signs of break-in, and nothing else in the house had been disturbed. Mr. Brennan, a bachelor who lived alone in the house where he had grown up, was baffled by the disappearance and spent weeks searching through closets and storage areas, convinced that he must have moved the box and forgotten where he had placed it. Detective Williams noted that each report described the same puzzling circumstances: items disappearing from secure homes with no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, and no other disturbances. The victims were honest, reliable people who were certain about where they had last seen their missing belongings. Officer Murphy had investigated each case thoroughly, interviewing neighbors, checking for possible explanations, and maintaining detailed records of every incident. As the reports continued through 1996 and 1997, a more troubling pattern began to emerge. The missing items seemed to be chosen for their emotional significance to the owners rather than their monetary value. Wedding photographs, family heirlooms, children's toys, personal letters, and other irreplaceable mementos disappeared, while valuable items in the same homes remained untouched. It was as if someone was deliberately selecting objects that would cause the maximum emotional distress to their owners. In September 1997, the Kowalski family reported that a hand-knitted baby blanket had disappeared from their infant son's nursery. The blanket had been made by the child's grandmother and was used every night to help the baby sleep. Mrs. Kowalski was certain that she had placed the blanket in the nursery before putting the baby to bed, but when she went to check on him during the night, the blanket was nowhere to be found. The family searched their entire house and questioned relatives and babysitters, but the blanket was never located. Detective Williams found Officer Murphy's notes particularly detailed for this case, perhaps because it involved an infant and had caused such distress to the young parents. Murphy had conducted extensive interviews with everyone who had access to the Kowalski home, and had even organized a neighborhood search to look for the blanket in case it had somehow been carried outside. His report noted that several neighbors had experienced similar incidents of missing personal items, and that the community was becoming increasingly concerned about what appeared to be a pattern of inexplicable thefts. The reports from 1998 and 1999 showed that Officer Murphy had begun to coordinate his investigations, looking for connections between the various incidents and trying to identify possible suspects within the village. He had created a map showing the locations of all the reported thefts and had noted that they occurred throughout Millfield, without regard to geographic clustering or proximity to main roads. He had also compiled a list of people who had access to multiple homes in the village, including delivery personnel, utility workers, and service providers, but had found no evidence linking any of these individuals to the missing items. One of the most heartbreaking reports came from the elderly Mitchell couple in November 1999. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, who were in their 80s and had been married for more than 60 years, discovered that their collection of love letters from their courtship had disappeared from a drawer in their bedroom. The letters, written during the 1930s when Mr. Mitchell was working in another state, represented the foundation of their relationship and were among their most treasured possessions. The couple was devastated by the loss and spent their remaining years wondering what had happened to the letters that had chronicled their young love. Detective Williams found herself deeply affected by the stories contained in these old reports. Each incident represented a profound loss for families who had been robbed not of material wealth, but of their most precious memories and connections to loved ones. The systematic nature of the thefts and their focus on emotionally significant items suggested that the perpetrator understood the psychological impact of their actions and was deliberately choosing to inflict maximum emotional damage on their victims. The reports continued through the early 2000s with the same puzzling pattern. In 2001, the Patterson family lost a photo album chronicling their daughter's first year of life. In 2002, Mrs. Dorothy Evans discovered that a recipe book, handwritten by her mother, had vanished from her kitchen counter. In 2003, the Schneider family found that their son's first communion rosary was missing from his bedroom. Each incident followed the same inexplicable pattern. Valuable items remained untouched while irreplaceable. Mementos disappeared without explanation. Officer Murphy's reports showed increasing frustration with his inability to solve the cases or identify any suspects. He had consulted with state police investigators and had even requested assistance from federal authorities, but no one could provide an explanation for the pattern of thefts or suggest effective investigative approaches. The incidents had begun to affect the entire community, with residents becoming suspicious of neighbors and reluctant to trust anyone with access to their homes. The final report in the folder was dated September 12, 2005, and described the disappearance of a Purple Heart medal that had belonged to Mr. George Romano's father, who had been killed in World War II. The medal, which represented the ultimate sacrifice made by Mr. Romano's family for their country, had been displayed in a frame on the living room mantel for decades. Its disappearance was particularly painful for Mr. Romano, who felt that he had failed in his responsibility to preserve his father's memory and honor. Officer Murphy's investigation of this final incident was as thorough as all the others, but like the previous cases, it yielded no clues about the identity of the thief or the location of the missing medal. However, Murphy's final report noted an interesting detail. Several residents had mentioned seeing an unfamiliar person in the village around the time of recent thefts, though no one could provide a detailed description or identify any suspicious behavior. The sightings were too vague and inconsistent to pursue as investigative leads, but they represented the first potential breakthrough in the 10-year series of unsolved cases. After September 2005, the reports of missing personal items in Millfield stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Officer Murphy continued to patrol the village and investigate occasional minor crimes, but no additional reports of missing sentimental items were filed with the police department. The mystery remained unsolved when the Millfield Police Department was dissolved as part of the county consolidation effort, and Officer Murphy retired with the satisfaction of a long career, but the frustration of never having solved the case that had haunted his community for a decade. Detective Williams decided to visit Millfield to interview residents who might remember the incidents from the 1990s and early 2000s. The drive through the rural countryside took her past farms and small towns that seemed untouched by the rapid changes of the modern world. Millfield itself appeared much as it probably had decades earlier, with the same modest homes, small businesses, and agricultural buildings that had served the farming community for generations. At the post office, which served as an informal information center for the village, Detective Williams met with Mrs. Janet Sullivan, who had worked there for more than 30 years and knew virtually every resident of Millfield and the surrounding area. Mrs. Sullivan remembered the period of missing personal items clearly and described how the incidents had affected the entire community. People had become more careful about locking their doors and had been reluctant to discuss their personal belongings or family treasures with anyone outside their immediate families. Mrs. Sullivan also confirmed the detail that Officer Murphy had noted in his final report about an unfamiliar person being seen in the village during the period when the thefts were occurring. According to her recollection, several residents had mentioned seeing someone walking through the village at unusual hours, often in the early morning or late evening when most people were indoors. The person had been described as average height and build, wearing ordinary clothes, and had not appeared to be doing anything obviously suspicious. However, the sightings had been consistent enough that some residents had begun to associate them with the mysterious disappearances of their personal belongings. Detective Williams interviewed several families who had been affected by the thefts, including some whose cases were documented in the police files she had discovered. Mrs. Ruth Henderson, now in her 90s, still lived in the same house where her wedding photograph had disappeared 25 years earlier. She had never replaced the photograph and still felt its absence keenly, describing how she had continued to look for it in unlikely places for years after its disappearance. Unable to accept that it was truly gone, the Walsh family, whose daughter's teddy bear had vanished in 1995, had moved away from Millfield several years after the incident, but Detective Williams was able to contact them by phone. Emma Walsh, now a grown woman with children of her own, still remembered the distress of losing her beloved stuffed animal and the way the incident had made her feel unsafe in her own home. Her parents confirmed that the disappearance had been traumatic for the entire family and had contributed to their decision to eventually leave the village. During her interviews, Detective Williams learned additional details about the community's experience during the period of the thefts. Several residents mentioned that the incidents had seemed to target items that were displayed prominently in homes or that were known to have special significance to their owners. It was as if the thief had possessed detailed knowledge of each family's most treasured possessions and had deliberately chosen to steal items that would cause the greatest emotional pain. Mrs. Dorothy Evans, whose mother's recipe book had disappeared in 2002, told Detective Williams that she had always suspected that the thief was someone who knew the village and its residents well. The items that were stolen were often things that visitors to the homes would have noticed and remembered, suggesting that the perpetrator had been inside many of the affected houses and had observed which belongings were most precious to their owners. This observation led Detective Williams to consider the possibility that the thief had been someone who had legitimate access to many homes in the village, such as a service provider, delivery person, or maintenance worker. She obtained employment records from local businesses and utility companies that had operated in the Millfield area during the 1990s and early 2000s, looking for individuals who would have had regular access to residential properties One name that appeared repeatedly in these records was David Hartman, who had worked as a handyman and home repair contractor throughout the region during the exact period when the thefts had occurred. Hartman had advertised his services in local newspapers and had built a reputation for reliable, affordable work on everything from plumbing repairs to furniture refinishing. Many of his customers were elderly residents who appreciated his careful, respectful approach to working in their homes. Detective Williams discovered that David Hartman had moved away from the area in late 2005, shortly after the last reported theft in Millfield. His forwarding address led to a town in northern Michigan, where he had apparently continued working as a contractor. However, when Detective Williams contacted law enforcement agencies in that area, she learned that David Hartman had died in 2018 from natural causes, taking with him any secrets he might have had about the missing belongings of Millfield. Further, investigation into Hartman's background revealed some troubling details about his personal life and mental health. According to family members who agreed to speak with Detective Williams, Hartman had struggled with depression and social isolation throughout his adult life. He had never married and had few close relationships, finding comfort primarily in his work and in the trust that elderly customers placed in him. When they allowed him into their homes, Hartman's sister, who lived in Michigan, told Detective Williams that her brother had always been fascinated by other people's family histories and personal belongings. He would spend hours looking through old photographs and mementos when working in customers' homes, and would often ask detailed questions about the stories behind family heirlooms and treasured possessions. She had assumed that this interest was simply part of his careful, thoughtful approach to his work, but in retrospect, she wondered whether it might have represented something more troubling. The sister also revealed that after David's death, she had been tasked with cleaning out his small apartment and had discovered several boxes of personal items that didn't appear to belong to him. The items included old photographs, letters, small pieces of jewelry, books, and various mementos that seemed to be family keepsakes from different households. At the time, she had assumed that these were items that customers had given to David or that he had acquired at estate sales, and she had donated them to local charity organizations without realizing their potential significance. This revelation provided Detective Williams with a possible explanation for the decade-long series of thefts in Millfield. David Hartman, working as a handyman in customers' homes, would have had access to the personal belongings that later went missing. His apparent fascination with family histories and treasured possessions might have evolved into an obsession that drove him to steal items that represented other people's most precious memories and connections. The psychological profile that emerged from Detective Williams' investigation suggested that Hartman's thefts were motivated not by financial gain, but by a desire to possess the emotional connections and family bonds that he had never experienced in his own isolated life. By stealing photographs, letters, and other mementos, he might have been trying to acquire the sense of belonging and family history that had been missing from his own existence. However, without the ability to interview David Hartman directly or to examine the items that had been found in his apartment, Detective Williams could not definitively prove his involvement in the Millfield thefts. The evidence was circumstantial, and many of the affected families had employed various contractors and service providers during the relevant time period. While Hartman remained the most likely suspect, the case would have to remain technically unsolved. Detective Williams prepared a comprehensive report summarizing her investigation and her conclusions about the probable identity of the person responsible for the Millfield thefts. She shared this report with the families who had been affected by the incidents, providing them with at least a possible explanation for their losses, even though their treasured belongings would never be recovered. For many of the families, learning about David Hartman and his probable role in the thefts provided a sense of closure that had been missing for decades. Mrs. Ruth Henderson, who had lost her wedding photograph in 1995, told Detective Williams that knowing why the picture had been taken helped her to finally accept its loss and to focus on the memories she still carried in her heart rather than mourning the physical photograph that had been stolen. The case highlighted the devastating impact that crimes against sentimental property could have on victims, even when no monetary loss was involved. The families of Millfield had been robbed not of their wealth, but of their most precious connections to loved ones and family history. The emotional damage caused by these thefts had lasted for decades and had affected the entire community's sense of safety and trust. Detective Williams' investigation also revealed the importance of recognizing patterns in seemingly unrelated crimes and the value of preserving detailed records even when cases cannot be immediately solved. Officer Murphy's careful documentation of each incident had made it possible, decades later, to identify the connections between the thefts and to develop a theory about their perpetrator's identity and motivations. The village of Millfield continued its quiet existence among the farmlands of southern Ohio, with new families moving in to replace those who had left and children growing up without knowledge of the mysterious decade when personal treasures had vanished from their neighbors' homes. The post office still served as a gathering place for residents to share news and gossip, and Mrs. Sullivan continued to greet visitors and provide information about the community's history and current events. For Detective Williams, the Millfield case became a reminder of the complex motivations that could drive criminal behavior and the lasting impact that even nonviolent crimes could have on victims and communities. The case also demonstrated the importance of looking beyond obvious explanations and considering the psychological factors that might influence criminal conduct, especially in cases involving unusual patterns of behavior or target selection. The boxes of cold case files in the Consolidated Police Department's warehouse contained dozens of other unsolved mysteries from small rural communities, each representing families and individuals whose lives had been touched by unexplained crimes or disappearances. Detective Williams continued her work reviewing these forgotten cases, looking for patterns and connections that might finally provide answers to questions that had puzzled law enforcement officers for decades. In the end, the story of Millfield's missing belongings became a testament to the enduring power of memory and the irreplaceable value of the personal items that connect us to our loved ones and our family histories. While the stolen photographs, letters, and mementos were never recovered, the memories they represented lived on in the hearts of those who had treasured them, proving that some things cannot truly be stolen, no matter how carefully a thief might plan their crimes. The rural landscape around Millfield continued to change with the seasons, with fields of corn and soybeans giving way to winter snow and then to spring planting, in the eternal cycle that had sustained these farming communities for generations. The stories of the families who had lived and loved in this quiet corner of Ohio became part of the community's collective memory, preserved not in stolen photographs or missing letters, but in the ongoing narrative of human connection that no thief could ever truly possess or destroy. Tonight, we travel to Riverside Falls, a picturesque town nestled along the banks of the Clearwater River in northern Vermont, where decades of police records reveal a pattern of quiet, unexplained disturbances that occurred with mysterious regularity from the 1970s through the early 2000s. The town, with its population of just over 2,000 residents, had built its identity around the natural beauty of the river and the historic covered bridge that had connected the east and west sides of the community since 1847. Main Street followed the gentle curve of the riverbank, lined with Victorian homes that had been converted into bed and breakfasts, antique shops, and the small businesses that catered to the tourists who came to see the famous autumn foliage and to experience the timeless charm of a classic New England village. Sergeant Ellen Martinez had been assigned to digitize the Riverside Falls Police Department's historical records as part of a state initiative to preserve local law enforcement archives when she discovered what appeared to be an unusual pattern in the incident reports, spanning more than 3 decades. Working in the basement of the old town hall during the quiet winter months of 2021, surrounded by boxes of yellowed carbon copy reports and handwritten logs, Sergeant Martinez found herself drawn into a mystery that had puzzled every police chief who had served the community during those years. Pattern that emerged from her careful review of the records was subtle but unmistakable. Every spring, usually during the months of April and May, residents throughout Riverside Falls would begin reporting strange disturbances in their homes and on their properties. The incidents were never dramatic or dangerous, but they created an atmosphere of unease that would settle over the town like morning fog rising from the river, persisting through the summer months before gradually fading as autumn arrived and the tourist season ended. The earliest report, Sergeant Martinez, found dated to April 1973, when Mrs. Helen Pritchard called the police to report that someone had been rearranging the furniture on her front porch during the night. Mrs. Pritchard, who lived in a white colonial house overlooking the river, had discovered that her wicker chairs and small table had been moved into different positions, creating a new seating arrangement that faced toward the water rather than toward the street as she had always preferred. There were no signs of vandalism or theft, and the furniture had been moved carefully without any damage. But Mrs. Pritchard was disturbed by the evidence that someone had been on her property during the night. Chief Robert Sullivan, who had headed the small police department during the 1970s, had investigated Mrs. Pritchard's complaint thoroughly, checking for footprints in her garden and interviewing neighbors who might have seen unusual activity during the night. However, his report noted that the ground was too hard to show clear tracks, and no one in the neighborhood had noticed anything suspicious. Chief Sullivan had attributed the incident to teenagers playing a harmless prank, though Mrs. Pritchard had insisted that the furniture arrangement seemed too deliberate and artistic to be the work of mischievous young people. Similar reports followed throughout the spring and summer of 1973, each describing minor disturbances that suggested someone had been present on residential properties during the nighttime hours. Garden tools were found arranged in neat patterns on lawn edges. Lawn ornaments were repositioned to create new displays, and outdoor furniture was rearranged in ways that their owners found aesthetically pleasing, but personally unsettling. In every case, nothing was stolen or damaged, and the changes seemed to reflect an artistic sensibility rather than destructive intent. Mr. James Fletcher, who owned a hardware store on Main Street and lived in an apartment above his shop, reported in May 1973 that someone had reorganized the flower boxes outside his store windows during the night. The person had replanted the flowers in a more sophisticated arrangement, using principles of color and height that created a more visually appealing display than Mr. Fletcher's original planting. While he appreciated the improvement to his storefront's appearance, he was concerned about the implications of someone entering his property without permission and making changes to his landscaping. Chief Sullivan's investigation of the Fletcher incident revealed that several other business owners along Main Street had experienced similar mysterious improvements to their storefronts during the same time period. The owner of the antique shop had found that her outdoor display of vintage garden implements had been rearranged into an attractive vignette, while the proprietor of the local diner discovered that someone had weeded and replanted the small herb garden behind his establishment, creating a more organized and productive layout than his original design. The pattern continued year after year, with residents reporting similar incidents each spring. Sergeant Martinez found reports from 1974 describing garden sculptures that had been moved to create better visual compositions, from 1975 documenting outdoor Christmas decorations that had been rearranged in January to create more balanced displays, and from 1976 recording instances where children's outdoor toys had been organized into elaborate, artistic arrangements that parents found both impressive and disturbing. What made these incidents particularly puzzling was their consistency and the apparent skill and knowledge demonstrated by whoever was responsible for them. The rearrangements always showed an understanding of design principles, landscape aesthetics, and artistic composition that suggested formal training or extensive experience in these areas. Moreover, the changes were invariably improvements that enhanced the visual appeal of properties, leading some residents to appreciate the results even while feeling violated by the unauthorized intrusion. Mrs. Dorothy Hawkins, whose garden had been extensively redesigned during the night in April 1977, told Chief Sullivan that while she was upset by the invasion of her privacy, she had to admit that her property looked better than it ever had before. The unknown gardener had relocated her flower beds, pruned her shrubs with expert technique, and created focal points and sight lines that transformed her modest backyard into something resembling a professional landscape design. Mrs. Hawkins found herself torn between gratitude for the improvement and anger at the presumption of someone who would make such changes without her permission. By 1978, the annual spring disturbances had become a recognized phenomenon in Riverside Falls, with residents expecting and discussing the mysterious improvements that would appear overnight on properties throughout the town. Chief Sullivan had begun keeping a special file for these incidents and had started to look for patterns in the locations and types of changes that were made. His analysis revealed that the modifications seemed to focus on properties that were visible from the main roads through town or that could be seen from the popular walking paths along the river. The incidents also appeared to target homes and businesses where the existing landscaping or outdoor arrangements showed potential for improvement but lacked the professional expertise to achieve that potential. It was as if someone with advanced knowledge of gardening, design, and aesthetics was moving through the community each spring, identifying opportunities to enhance the town's visual appeal and acting on those opportunities without seeking permission or recognition for their work. Chief Sullivan consulted with state police investigators and with experts in psychology and criminal behavior, trying to understand the motivations behind the mysterious improvements. The experts suggested that the incidents might be the work of someone who had professional training in landscaping or design, but who lacked legitimate outlets for their skills, or who derived satisfaction from improving their community in secret rather than seeking public recognition for their work. In 1979, Chief Sullivan decided to conduct surveillance during the spring months, hoping to identify the person responsible for the annual disturbances. He organized volunteer patrols from among the town's residents and coordinated with county sheriff's deputies to maintain observation of the areas where incidents had been most frequent in previous years. However, despite weeks of careful watching, the surveillance efforts yielded no sightings of suspicious activity, and the mysterious improvements continued to appear throughout the spring season. The failure of the surveillance operation led to speculation that the person responsible for the improvements might be someone who was familiar with police procedures and who was able to avoid detection by timing their activities to avoid patrols, or by using knowledge of the surveillance schedule to work in areas that were not being watched. This theory suggested that the perpetrator might be a current or former law enforcement officer, a security professional, or someone else with specialized knowledge of investigative techniques. 1980s brought continued reports of the spring disturbances, but also some changes in their nature and scope. Sergeant Martinez found that the incidents from this period included more elaborate modifications that required significant time and effort to complete. Entire gardens were redesigned overnight. Outdoor living spaces were created from unused areas of properties, and some homes received complete landscape makeovers that would have cost thousands of dollars if performed by professional contractors. In April 1983, the Methodist Church's Memorial Garden, which had been neglected and overgrown for several years, was transformed overnight into a beautiful space of remembrance with carefully arranged plantings, restored pathways, and a new seating area constructed from materials that appeared to have been donated specifically for the project. The church's pastor, Reverend Michael Thompson, was amazed by the quality of the work and the obvious care that had been taken to honor the memory of community members whose names were inscribed on the memorial stones. Reverend Thompson's report to the police expressed gratitude for the anonymous gift while also acknowledging the complexity of the legal and ethical issues raised by the unauthorized improvements. The church board ultimately decided to accept and maintain the enhanced memorial garden while asking the police to continue their efforts to identify the person responsible so that proper thanks could be offered and future projects could be coordinated through official channels. The most ambitious project appeared in May 1985, when residents discovered that the small park beside the covered bridge had been completely redesigned with new walking paths, expanded flower beds, additional benches positioned to take advantage of river views, and a small gazebo constructed from materials that matched the historic architecture of the bridge itself. The quality of the construction and the integration of the improvements with the existing landscape suggested professional-level skills and significant investment of time and resources. Chief Sullivan, who had been investigating the mysterious improvements for more than a decade, recognized that this latest project represented an escalation in both scope and ambition. The person responsible was no longer simply rearranging existing elements, but was making substantial modifications that required advanced planning, significant financial resources, and construction skills beyond basic gardening and landscaping. The gazebo alone would have required permits, engineering expertise, and considerable time to complete. Yet, it had appeared overnight with no evidence of the construction process. The town council held a special meeting to discuss the bridge park improvements and the broader issue of the unauthorized enhancements that had been occurring throughout Riverside Falls for more than a decade. Community opinion was divided between those who appreciated the obvious care and skill that went into the projects and those who were concerned about the legal and safety implications of allowing unknown persons to make substantial modifications to public and private property. After considerable debate, the council decided to accept the park improvements while also voting to increase police patrols during the spring months and to install security cameras in areas where future incidents might occur. The council also authorized Chief Sullivan to work with state investigators to develop a more comprehensive approach to identifying the person or persons responsible for the mysterious enhancements. However, the increased security measures proved ineffective. The spring disturbances continued throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s with the same mysterious efficiency that had characterized them from the beginning. Security cameras captured no useful footage, increased patrols yielded no sightings, and rewards offered for information about the improvements generated no credible leads. The person responsible seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection while continuing to transform the town's appearance with each passing year. Sergeant Martinez found that the reports from the 1990s reflected a community that had gradually adapted to the annual phenomenon of mysterious improvements. Rather than treating the incidents as criminal matters, police reports from this period often describe them in neutral or even positive terms, acknowledging the beneficial nature of the changes while noting the ongoing mystery of their source. Some residents have begun to view the spring enhancements as a unique local tradition, similar to the annual return of migratory birds or the blooming of wildflowers along the riverbank. Mrs. Sarah Coleman, whose Victorian bed and breakfast had received a series of garden improvements over several years, told Chief Sullivan in 1994 that she had come to look forward to discovering what changes would appear on her property each spring. The improvements had enhanced her business by creating beautiful outdoor spaces that attracted guests and provided perfect settings for wedding photographs and special events. Mrs. Coleman admitted that while the mystery remained unsettling, The results had been uniformly positive and had contributed to her establishment's reputation as one of the most beautiful accommodations in the region. The final major incident documented in the police files occurred in May 2003, when residents throughout Riverside Falls awoke to discover that a comprehensive beautification project had been completed overnight throughout the downtown area. Every business along Main Street had received landscaping improvements. The municipal parking areas had been enhanced with attractive planters and seating areas, and the riverfront walking path had been extended and upgraded with new surface materials, lighting, and interpretive signs describing the area's natural and cultural history. Chief Patricia Walsh, who had succeeded Chief Sullivan in 1998, estimated that the improvements would have cost the town more than $50,000 if they had been completed through normal contracting procedures. The quality of the work was professional in every respect, and the materials used were of high quality and appropriate for the historic character of the downtown district. However, like all the previous improvements, the project had been completed without authorization and with no indication of who had been responsible or how the work had been accomplished without detection. Chief Walsh's investigation of the 2003 downtown improvements was the most comprehensive effort yet undertaken to identify the source of the mysterious enhancements. She worked with state police investigators, federal agents, and private security experts to analyze the scope and timing of the project, hoping to find clues that would finally reveal the identity of Riverside Falls' anonymous benefactor. Investigation revealed that the materials used in the improvements had been purchased from suppliers throughout New England over a period of several months, using cash payments that could not be traced to specific individuals. The purchases had been made by different people at different times, suggesting either a conspiracy involving multiple individuals or careful planning by someone who understood the importance of avoiding detection through purchasing patterns. However, despite the comprehensive investigation, no suspects were identified and no additional incidents occurred after 2003. The annual spring disturbances that had characterized Riverside Falls for 30 years simply stopped, leaving behind a transformed community and an unsolved mystery that continued to puzzle residents and law enforcement alike. Sergeant Martinez's review of the historical records led her to develop several theories about the identity and motivations of the person or persons responsible for the decades-long enhancement project. The most likely explanation, in her assessment, was that the improvements had been the work of a single individual with professional training in landscape architecture, urban planning, or a related field, who had chosen to use their skills to benefit their community while remaining anonymous. The timing of the incidents, which had continued for exactly 30 years before stopping abruptly, suggested that the person responsible might have moved away from the area, retired from their clandestine activities due to age or health issues, or died around 2003. The sophisticated understanding of design principles and construction techniques evident in the improvements suggested someone with formal education and extensive professional experience, possibly someone who had worked in landscape architecture, urban planning, or municipal development before choosing to apply their skills. In this unusual way, Sergeant Martinez also considered the possibility that the improvements had been funded and coordinated by a wealthy individual who cared deeply about the community's appearance and well-being, but who preferred to remain anonymous rather than seeking recognition or gratitude for their generosity. This theory would explain the high quality of the materials used and the professional level of the construction work, as well as the careful planning evident in the progression of improvements over 3 decades. During her research, Sergeant Martinez interviewed several longtime residents who had witnessed the full span of the mysterious improvements. Many of these individuals had developed their own theories about the identity of their anonymous benefactor, with speculation focusing on various community members who had possessed the necessary skills, resources, or motivation to undertake such an extensive project. Mr. Robert Daniels, who had served as the town's building inspector for 25 years before retiring in 2000, told Sergeant Martinez that he had always suspected the improvements were the work of someone with intimate knowledge of local building codes, zoning regulations, and permit procedures. The person responsible had always managed to avoid creating any violations or safety issues, suggesting familiarity with the technical requirements that governed construction and landscaping projects in the community. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, who had lived in Riverside Falls her entire life and had served on the town council for 15 years, shared her belief that the mysterious benefactor had been someone who truly loved the community and wanted to see it reach its full potential as a beautiful and welcoming place. She noted that the improvements had always been tasteful and appropriate for the town's historic character, never flashy or attention-seeking, suggesting someone who understood and respected the community's values and traditions. The mystery of Riverside Falls. Anonymous benefactor became part of the town's cultural identity, celebrated in local folklore and mentioned in tourist brochures as one of the community's unique historical features. The improvements themselves continued to enhance the town's appeal, attracting visitors who came to see the beautiful downtown district and the scenic river views that had been carefully preserved and enhanced through 3 decades of mysterious nighttime work. Sergeant Martinez concluded her investigation by preparing a comprehensive report that documented the full scope of the improvement project and summarized the various theories about its origins and purposes. While she was unable to definitively identify the person responsible, her research had revealed the profound impact that one individual's dedication and generosity had made on an entire community over the course of 3 decades. The case highlighted the positive potential of anonymous altruism and the lasting legacy that could be created by someone who chose to use their skills and resources for the benefit of others without seeking recognition or reward. The improvements to Riverside Falls had enhanced the quality of life for thousands of residents and visitors over the years, creating a more beautiful and welcoming community that would continue to benefit from this mysterious gift for generations to come. In the end, the identity of Riverside Falls' anonymous benefactor remained a mystery, but their legacy lived on in every carefully arranged flower bed, every thoughtfully positioned bench, and every beautifully designed landscape that continued to bring joy and inspiration to all who experienced the enhanced beauty of this special New England community. The person responsible had achieved a form of immortality through their work, creating a lasting monument to the power of quiet, generosity, and the difference that one dedicated individual could make in the lives of their neighbors. The Clearwater River continued to flow past the covered bridge, carrying with it the reflections of the beautiful community that had been transformed by decades of mysterious nighttime improvements. The town that had been enhanced by an unknown benefactor had become a testament to the possibility of anonymous altruism and the enduring impact of those who choose to make the world more beautiful without seeking credit for their contributions to the common good. Sergeant Martinez filed her report in the digitized archives that would preserve the story of Riverside Falls' transformation for future generations of residents and researchers. The mystery might never be solved, but the legacy of the improvements would continue to inspire others to consider how they might contribute to their own community's beauty and well-being, whether through public recognition or through the quiet satisfaction of anonymous generosity. The changing seasons continued to bring new beauty to Riverside Falls, with spring flowers blooming in carefully designed gardens, summer visitors enjoying thoughtfully positioned seating areas, autumn foliage framing perfectly composed views, and winter snow highlighting the architectural details that had been preserved and enhanced through 3 decades of mysterious care and attention. The town had become a living work of art, created through the vision and dedication of someone who had chosen to remain forever anonymous, leaving behind only the beauty they had created and the mystery of their identity that would continue to captivate residents and visitors for years to come. Asterisk tonight, we journey to the heart of a great metropolitan area, where the archives of the Central City Police Department hold decades of reports that tell a different kind of story, not of dramatic crimes that capture headlines, but of the countless small mysteries that slip through the cracks of urban life like leaves falling unnoticed on busy sidewalks. Detective Captain James Morrison had spent 32 years with the department when he was assigned to oversee the digitization of historical case files in preparation for the opening of a new police headquarters. The project, begun in the winter of 2019, required the careful review and cataloging of more than 50,000 incident reports dating back to the 1960s. The Central City Police Department served a metropolitan area of nearly 2 million residents, making it one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the region. The department's daily workload included everything from major felonies and federal investigations to routine traffic violations and noise complaints. However, it was the pattern of minor, seemingly unrelated incidents that caught Detective Captain Morrison's attention as he supervised the massive archival project in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Working with a team of civilian analysts and retired officers, Detective Captain Morrison had been tasked with identifying cases that could be closed administratively, cases that should remain active due to ongoing investigative potential, and cases that represented significant historical interest for the department's planned museum and training facility. It was during this sorting process that he began to notice a category of incident reports that didn't fit neatly into any of the established classifications: reports of minor disturbances, unexplained phenomena, and small mysteries that had occurred throughout the metropolitan area with remarkable consistency over more than 4 decades. The earliest report that fit this pattern dated to September 1963, when Mrs. Catherine Walsh called the police to report that someone had been leaving flowers on her doorstep every morning for 2 weeks. Mrs. Walsh, who lived alone in a 3rd-floor apartment in the Riverside district, would find a single fresh flower, sometimes a rose, sometimes a daisy, occasionally something more exotic like an orchid or bird of paradise placed carefully on her doormat when she left for work each morning. The flowers were always fresh and of good quality, and they were always accompanied by a small card with a brief, anonymous message of encouragement or kindness. Officer Michael O'Brien, who had responded to Mrs. Walsh's call, had found no evidence of suspicious activity in the apartment building's hallway or stairwell. The building's other residents had not reported any unusual visitors or disturbances, and the superintendent had not given anyone permission to enter the building during the early morning hours when the flowers were apparently being delivered. Officer O'Brien had conducted interviews with Mrs. Walsh's neighbors, co-workers, and family members, but no one could suggest who might be responsible for the anonymous gifts. Mrs. Walsh had initially been concerned that the flowers might represent some form of harassment or unwanted attention, but the messages on the cards were consistently positive and encouraging, never romantic or threatening in nature. The messages included sentiments like, "Hope your day is beautiful," "You make a difference," and "The world is brighter because you're in it." After several weeks of receiving the flowers, Mrs. Walsh began to look forward to the daily surprises and found that they provided a source of comfort and joy during a difficult period in her life when she was caring for her elderly mother and working 2 jobs to make ends meet. The flower deliveries continued for exactly 3 months before stopping as suddenly as they had begun. With no explanation or farewell message, Mrs. Walsh had contacted the police again to report that the flowers had stopped, not because she suspected any criminal activity, but because she wanted to know if the officers had ever determined who had been responsible for the kindness she had received. Officer O'Brien's follow-up report noted that the case remained unsolved, but that no crime had been committed, and the matter was filed away as a minor mystery, with no ongoing investigative value. Detective Captain Morrison found dozens of similar reports scattered throughout the departments, files from the 1960s and 1970s, each describing small acts of anonymous kindness or mysterious positive interventions that had touched the lives of city residents. In 1967, residents of an entire apartment building in the industrial district had reported finding their hallways and stairwells cleaned and decorated with fresh flowers every weekend for 2 months. In 1971, elderly residents throughout the Elm Street neighborhood had discovered that their sidewalks had been shoveled and their steps salted after every snowstorm during what was remembered as one of the city's harshest winters. The reports from the 1970s included an incident where someone had anonymously paid the overdue utility bills for 36 families facing disconnection notices, leaving no name or return address but preventing numerous households from losing their heat and electricity during a particularly cold February. Another report described how someone had secretly restocked the food pantry at St. Mark's Community Center every week for 6 months, providing groceries for families who depended on the center's assistance programs. What distinguished these incidents from typical charitable giving was their anonymous nature and their focus on individuals or families who were facing specific hardships or challenges. The anonymous benefactors seemed to possess detailed knowledge of people's circumstances and needs, suggesting either an extensive network of information sources or an individual who was deeply embedded in the community and aware of neighbors' struggles and difficulties. Officer Patricia Hendricks, who had worked the downtown beat during the 1970s, had investigated several of these anonymous kindness incidents and had developed her own theories about their origins. Her reports noted that the benefactors seemed to have significant financial resources, given the scale and consistency of the assistance provided, but also appeared to have intimate knowledge of the city's most vulnerable residents and the social service organizations that served them. Detective Captain Morrison found that the pattern of anonymous assistance had continued throughout the failed 1980s and 1990s, adapting to changing urban conditions and emerging needs within the community. During the economic recession of the early 1980s, reports described anonymous job assistance, including career counseling services and job placement help that appeared to be provided by someone with connections to major employers throughout the metropolitan area. In the late 1980s, when crack cocaine was devastating inner-city neighborhoods, anonymous donations supported drug treatment programs and provided assistance to families affected by addiction. The reports from the one-over 1990s included incidents where someone had anonymously funded college scholarships for dozens of high school students from low-income families, covering not only tuition expenses but also providing money for books, housing, and other educational expenses. The scholarship recipients had been selected through existing programs at various high schools and community organizations, but the funding source remained completely anonymous despite extensive efforts by school administrators and social workers to identify and thank the donor. During the dot-com boom of the late 1990s, when housing costs were forcing longtime residents out of the city's traditional neighborhoods, reports described anonymous assistance with rent payments, down payments for home purchases, and support for community organizations fighting displacement and gentrification. The assistance was always provided in ways that preserved the dignity and privacy of the recipients, often channeled through established social service agencies or community groups that served as intermediaries between the anonymous donor and those who received help. Detective Captain Morrison was particularly intrigued by reports from the early 2000s that described sophisticated anonymous interventions in complex social problems. Someone had apparently coordinated with multiple city agencies to address chronic homelessness among specific individuals, providing not just temporary assistance, but comprehensive support that included housing placement, job training, medical care, and ongoing case management. The coordination required to provide such comprehensive assistance suggested either a team of professionals working together or an individual with extensive knowledge of the city's social service system and the bureaucratic processes involved in accessing various forms of assistance. The most remarkable series of incidents occurred during the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009, when foreclosure proceedings were threatening thousands of families throughout the metropolitan area. Reports described anonymous payments that prevented foreclosures for dozens of families, but the assistance went beyond simple financial help to include legal representation, credit counseling, and long-term financial planning support that helped families stabilize their situations and avoid future crises. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chun, who had been assigned to investigate potential fraud in some of the foreclosure assistance cases, had been amazed by the legitimate and professional nature of the interventions. The anonymous benefactor had worked through established legal and financial service organizations, providing not just money, but ensuring that families received the professional guidance they needed to address the underlying causes of their financial difficulties. Asterisk. As Detective Captain Morrison continued his review of the historical files, he began to see a pattern that extended far beyond simple charitable giving. The anonymous interventions represented a comprehensive, decades-long effort to address systemic problems within the urban community, providing assistance that was carefully targeted, professionally administered, and designed to create lasting positive change rather than temporary relief. The benefactor's approach had evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated and comprehensive as urban problems became more complex, and as the city's social service infrastructure developed new capabilities and approaches. The early incidents had focused on immediate needs like food, shelter, and safety, while later interventions addressed more complex issues like education, employment, housing stability, and community development. Detective Captain Morrison assembled a team of analysts to create a comprehensive database of all the anonymous assistance incidents documented in the department's files, hoping to identify patterns that might reveal the identity or organizational structure behind the decades-long benevolent campaign. The database ultimately included more than 800 separate incidents spanning 46 years, representing millions of dollars in assistance and services provided to thousands of individuals and families throughout the metropolitan area. The analysis revealed several important patterns in the timing, location, and nature of the interventions. The assistance had been consistently focused on the city's most economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, with particular attention to areas experiencing rapid social or economic change. The benefactor had demonstrated remarkable prescience in identifying emerging problems and developing interventions before crises reached their peak, suggesting access to high-level data and analysis about urban, social, and economic trends. The geographic distribution of the incidents suggested that the benefactor had comprehensive knowledge of the entire metropolitan area, not just specific neighborhoods or communities. The assistance had reached every district of the city and had addressed the particular needs and challenges facing different ethnic, racial, and cultural communities. The cultural sensitivity evident in many of the interventions suggested either extensive research or personal connections to the various communities that had received assistance. Detective Captain Morrison's investigation also revealed that the anonymous assistance had consistently complemented rather than duplicated existing social services, suggesting coordination with official agencies and nonprofit organizations. The benefactor had seemed to identify gaps in the social safety net and had provided assistance in areas where traditional funding sources were inadequate or unavailable. In 2010, the pattern of anonymous assistance had begun to change in ways that suggested either a transition in leadership or a strategic shift in approach. Rather than providing direct assistance to individuals and families, the interventions had increasingly focused on supporting community organizations, advocacy groups, and systemic reform efforts. Anonymous funding had supported policy research, community organizing, and advocacy campaigns that addressed the root causes of urban problems rather than their symptoms. The final documented incident in Detective Captain Morrison's database occurred in December 2018, when an anonymous donor had provided a substantial endowment to establish a community foundation dedicated to addressing poverty and inequality throughout the metropolitan area. The foundation's board of directors had been carefully selected to represent various communities and constituencies that had been served by the decades of anonymous assistance, and the foundation's mission statement seemed to represent a formalization and institutionalization of the work that had been conducted anonymously for more than 50 years. Detective Captain Morrison's investigation into the identity of the anonymous benefactor had yielded few concrete leads, but had generated considerable speculation about the resources and organizational structure that would have been required to sustain such an extensive and long-term operation. The financial resources alone would have represented tens of millions of dollars over the decades, suggesting involvement by a wealthy individual, a family foundation, or a coalition of donors working together toward common goals. The investigation had also revealed the sophisticated intelligence gathering and planning capabilities that would have been necessary to identify specific needs and coordinate appropriate interventions. The benefactor had demonstrated knowledge of confidential information about individuals' financial situations, family circumstances, and personal challenges that would have been difficult to obtain without insider access to social service agencies, financial institutions, or government records. Some investigators had theorized that the anonymous assistance might have been coordinated by a network of social service professionals, religious leaders, and community activists who had pooled their resources and expertise to address urban problems more effectively than any single organization could have accomplished. This theory would explain the professional quality of the interventions and the detailed knowledge of community needs that had characterized the assistance over many decades. Other investigators had focused on the possibility that the benefactor might have been a wealthy individual who had grown up in the city and had maintained strong emotional connections to the community throughout their career and life. This theory suggested someone who had achieved significant financial success but had chosen to give back to their hometown in ways that preserved their privacy while maximizing the impact of their generosity. The case had attracted the attention of investigative journalists and academic researchers who were interested in documenting the phenomenon of large-scale anonymous philanthropy and its impact on urban communities. However, their efforts to identify the benefactor had been no more successful than the police department's investigation, suggesting either extraordinary operational security or a carefully designed legal and financial structure that protected the donor's identity while enabling the distribution of assistance. Detective Captain Morrison had concluded his investigation with a comprehensive report that documented the scope and impact of the anonymous assistance program while acknowledging that the identity of the benefactor remained unknown. The report had been classified as a cold case due to the absence of any criminal activity, but it had been preserved in the department's historical archives as a unique example of positive mystery and community impact. The legacy of the anonymous benefactor continued to influence the metropolitan area long after the direct assistance had ended. The community foundation established in 2018 had become a major force for addressing urban problems and had inspired other philanthropic initiatives throughout the region. Many of the individuals and families who had received anonymous assistance over the decades had gone on to become community leaders and advocates, carrying forward the spirit of generosity and civic engagement that had been modeled for them during their times of need. The police officers who had investigated the various incidents of anonymous assistance had been profoundly affected by their encounters with systematic kindness and generosity. Many had developed more positive perspectives on their role in the community and had become advocates for community policing approaches that emphasized collaboration and mutual support rather than enforcement and punishment. Detective Captain Morrison had retired from the police department shortly after completing the historical file project, but he had continued to volunteer with various community organizations that served the city's most vulnerable residents. His experience investigating the anonymous assistance cases had convinced him that individual actions, even when taken quietly and without recognition, could have profound and lasting impacts on entire communities. The story of the anonymous benefactor had become part of the city's unofficial folklore, passed down through families and community organizations as an example of the positive change that was possible when people chose to use their resources and skills to help others. The mystery of the benefactor's identity had never been solved, but the impact of their generosity continued to ripple through the community, inspiring others to consider how they might contribute to the common good. In the end, the case of the Metropolitan Files had revealed that some of the most significant law enforcement investigations are those that document not crimes and their consequences, but acts of kindness and their lasting legacy. The anonymous benefactor had created a different kind of public safety, one based on mutual support and community care rather than punishment and deterrence. And their example continued to influence how the city's residents and institutions approach the challenges of urban life. The great city continued to evolve and grow, facing new challenges and opportunities with each passing year. But the foundation of community care and mutual support established through decades of anonymous assistance remained a permanent part of its character. The benefactor's identity might never be known, but their vision of a more caring and supportive urban community had been realized through the countless individual acts of generosity and kindness that had been inspired by their example and sustained by the institutions and relationships they had helped to create. Tonight, we travel to Beacon Harbor, a coastal town in Maine where the salt air carries more than just the scent of the sea. The town's police archive holds decades of reports about the night workers. At the docks, reports that paint a picture of mystery, community, and the quiet guardians who watched over those who made their living from the ocean's bounty. Detective Sergeant Anna Reed had been with the Beacon Harbor Police Department for 15 years when she was assigned to review the department's historical files in preparation for the town's bicentennial celebration in 2022. Beacon Harbor, with its population of just over 4,000 residents, had built its identity around the fishing industry and the working waterfront that had sustained the community since its founding in 1822. The harbor was home to more than 60 fishing vessels, from small lobster boats operated by individual fishermen to larger trawlers that brought crews out for weeks at a time to harvest the rich fishing grounds of the North Atlantic. The docks operated around the clock during fishing season, with boats departing before dawn and returning at all hours depending on tides, weather, and the success of their ventures. The police department's involvement with the waterfront had always been minimal, limited primarily to occasional disputes between fishermen, minor theft reports, and the rare incidents involving intoxicated crew members returning from long trips at sea. However, as Detective Sergeant Reed reviewed the historical files dating back to the 1970s, she discovered a series of reports that documented strange and unexplained activities involving the night workers who loaded, unloaded, and maintained the fishing fleet during the dark hours when most of the town was asleep. The earliest report that captured Detective Sergeant Reed's attention was dated November 1978, when Harbor Master William Thorne called the police to report unusual activity on Dock 7 during the overnight shift. Mr. Thorne, who had worked at the harbor for more than 20 years, had arrived at his office early that morning to find that someone had organized and cleaned the entire dock area during the night. Fishing gear that had been scattered and tangled was neatly arranged. Debris had been cleared from the walkways, and even the dock buildings had been swept and organized. What made the incident particularly puzzling was that no night workers had been scheduled for Dock 7 that evening, and the cleaning and organization work appeared to have required several hours of coordinated effort by multiple people. Harbor Master Thorne had questioned the night shift supervisors from the other docks, but no one could explain who had been working on Dock 7 or why they had undertaken such an extensive cleaning project without authorization. Officer Daniel McCarthy, who had responded to Harbor Master Thorne's call, found no evidence of break-ins or theft at any of the dock facilities. The buildings had been locked when the harbor master arrived, and nothing appeared to be missing from the gear and supplies that had been organized. If anything, the mysterious night workers had improved the condition of the dock area, making it safer and more efficient for the fishing crews who would be using the facilities. Similar reports appeared in the police files throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, describing mysterious maintenance and improvement work that occurred during the overnight hours at various locations throughout the harbor. Fishing nets were repaired and reinforced by unknown hands. Boat engines received unauthorized but expert maintenance, and dock facilities were improved with modifications that enhanced their safety and functionality. Captain Robert Sullivan, who had commanded the Beacon Harbor Police Department during this period, had initially treated these incidents as potential trespassing or vandalism cases. However, as the reports accumulated and it became clear that the unauthorized work was consistently beneficial rather than harmful, Captain Sullivan had begun to view the incidents as a unique community phenomenon rather than a criminal matter. In March 1981, the crew of the fishing vessel Mary Catherine reported that their boat had received extensive maintenance work while it was moored at the harbor overnight. The engine had been tuned, the nets had been repaired, and several safety issues that the crew had been planning to address had been fixed by someone with professional-level mechanical and seamanship skills. The quality of the work was so high that the boat's captain, Frank Morrison, estimated that it would have cost several $1,000s if performed by a commercial marine service. Captain Morrison had questioned other boat owners and dock workers, but no one could explain who had worked on his vessel or why they had chosen to provide such valuable assistance without payment or recognition. The work had been completed with materials that appeared to have been purchased specifically for the project, and the modifications had been made with careful attention to the specific needs and characteristics of the Mary Catherine and her fishing operations. Detective Sergeant Reed found that the reports from the 1980s and 1990s described an increasingly organized and comprehensive support system that operated during the night hours at Beacon Harbor. The mysterious workers seemed to have developed detailed knowledge of every fishing vessel in the harbor, providing maintenance and improvements that were perfectly suited to each boat's specific needs and operating requirements. In addition to mechanical work, the night workers had begun providing other forms of assistance that enhanced the safety and efficiency of the fishing operations. Weather monitoring equipment was installed and maintained. Safety equipment was regularly inspected and updated, and navigation aids were improved and expanded throughout the harbor area. The work was always professional in quality and appropriate for the harsh marine environment, suggesting expertise in multiple technical specialties. The most remarkable incident occurred in October 1987, when Hurricane Gloria threatened the Maine coast with devastating winds and storm surge. The fishing fleet had only hours to prepare for the storm, but when boat owners and crews arrived at the harbor to secure their vessels, they found that extensive storm preparations had already been completed during the night. Boats had been moved to safer moorings, additional lines had been installed, and protective measures had been taken that likely prevented millions of dollars in damage to the fleet and harbor facilities. Captain Thomas Burke, who had witnessed the aftermath of the storm preparations, told Officer McCarthy that the work had been so comprehensive and expertly executed that it would have required a coordinated effort by dozens of experienced marine professionals. The preparations had demonstrated intimate knowledge of each vessel's vulnerabilities and had included specialized storm protection techniques that were not widely known among the local fishing community. The investigation of the storm preparation incident had led Captain Sullivan to expand his inquiry into the identity and organization of the mysterious night workers. He had consulted with marine insurance investigators, federal agencies responsible for port security, and maritime industry experts. But no one could provide an explanation for the sophisticated and coordinated assistance that was being provided to the Beacon Harbor Fishing Fleet. One theory that emerged from these consultations was that the night workers might represent a form of maritime mutual aid society, possibly connected to fishing communities in other regions or to maritime labor organizations that maintained informal networks of support among working waterfronts. This theory would explain the professional expertise evident in the assistance and the focus on safety and operational improvements that benefited the entire fishing community. Another theory suggested that the night workers might be retired fishermen and marine workers who had maintained their connections to the harbor and who had chosen to contribute their skills and knowledge to support the next generation of fishing families. This theory was supported by the deep understanding of local conditions and fishing operations that was evident in the improvements and maintenance work. Detective Sergeant Reed found that the reports from the 1990s and early 2000s documented an evolution in the activities of the night workers toward more sophisticated and technologically advanced forms of assistance. Modern navigation equipment was installed and maintained. Electronic fish-finding devices were upgraded and optimized, and communication systems were improved to enhance safety and coordination. Among the fishing fleet, the night workers had also begun providing assistance with regulatory compliance and documentation requirements that had become increasingly complex as fishing industry regulations evolved. Vessel safety inspections were conducted and documented. Fishing permits and licenses were organized and updated, and environmental compliance measures were implemented in ways that helped fishing operations meet regulatory requirements while maintaining their economic viability. In 2003, when the fishing industry was struggling with declining fish stocks and increasing competition from larger commercial operations, the night workers had expanded their assistance to include business planning and marketing support. Fishing operations received help with financial planning, equipment purchasing decisions, and marketing strategies that helped them adapt to changing economic conditions in the industry. The most significant intervention occurred in 2008, when the global economic crisis threatened the financial stability of many fishing operations in Beacon Harbor. Several boat owners had been facing foreclosure or bankruptcy, but anonymous financial assistance appeared that helped them restructure their debts and maintain their operations during the economic downturn. The assistance was provided through established marine lending institutions, but the source of the funding remained completely anonymous. Captain Patricia Walsh, who had led the police department during this period, had investigated the financial assistance to ensure that it was legitimate and not connected to any form of money laundering or criminal activity. Her investigation had confirmed that the funding was clean and legally obtained, but she had been unable to identify its source despite extensive cooperation with federal financial investigators. The pattern of assistance had continued through the 2010s, adapting to new challenges facing the fishing industry, including climate change impacts on fish populations, increased regulatory requirements, and competition from aquaculture operations. The night workers had provided assistance with environmental monitoring, sustainable fishing practices, and diversification strategies that helped traditional fishing operations remain viable in a changing industry. Detective Sergeant Reed's review of the most recent reports indicated that the activities of the night workers had begun to focus more on training and education for younger fishermen and their families. Anonymous scholarships had been provided for maritime education programs, and technical training opportunities had been made available to help fishing families develop skills that would enable them to adapt to changing conditions in the industry. The investigation had also revealed that the night workers' assistance had expanded beyond the immediate fishing community to include support for related businesses and organizations throughout Beacon Harbor. Marine supply companies, boat repair facilities, and restaurants that served the fishing community had all received various forms of assistance that helped them maintain their operations and continue serving the working waterfront. In 2019, when the COVID-19 pandemic threatened the economic survival of many small businesses in Beacon Harbor, the night workers had coordinated a comprehensive support effort that included financial assistance, supply chain management, and marketing help that enabled many businesses to survive the economic disruption. The assistance had been provided through established business organizations and economic development agencies, but the coordination and funding had clearly come from the same anonymous source that had been supporting the community for decades. Detective Sergeant Reed had attempted to identify patterns in the timing and location of the night workers' activities that might reveal their identity or organizational structure. However, the assistance had been provided so consistently and professionally over such an extended period that it seemed to represent an institutional capability rather than the work of individual volunteers or philanthropists. The investigation had revealed that the night workers had maintained detailed knowledge of every aspect of the fishing industry and related businesses in Beacon Harbor, suggesting either an extensive intelligence gathering operation or the involvement of individuals who were deeply embedded in the community and its economic activities. The quality and appropriateness of the assistance had consistently reflected expert knowledge of marine operations, business management, and regulatory requirements. One of the most intriguing aspects of the night workers' activities was their apparent ability to coordinate with official agencies and organizations while maintaining their anonymity. The assistance had consistently complemented rather than duplicated official programs and services, suggesting communication with government agencies, industry organizations, and educational institutions. Detective Sergeant Reed had interviewed dozens of current and former fishing industry workers, but none had been able to provide definitive information about the identity of the night workers. Many had theories and speculation, but the actual operations had been conducted with such discretion and professionalism that even the direct beneficiaries of the assistance had limited knowledge of how it was organized and funded. The most common theory among fishing industry veterans was that the night workers represented a coalition of retired fishermen, marine professionals, and successful business people who had maintained their connection to Beacon Harbor and had chosen to support the community that had provided them with their livelihoods and careers. This theory was supported by the deep technical knowledge evident in the assistance and the focus on preserving the traditional fishing culture while helping it adapt to modern challenges. Another theory suggested that the night workers might be connected to one of the fishing families that had achieved significant financial success and had chosen to give back to the community in ways that preserved their privacy while maximizing the impact of their generosity. Several fishing families had expanded their operations into related businesses or had made successful investments that would have provided the resources necessary to fund decades of community assistance. As Detective Sergeant Reed concluded her review of the historical files, she reflected on the unique nature of the mystery that had been documented in the police reports. Unlike most of the cases she had investigated during her career, the night workers represented a positive mystery that had enhanced rather than threatened community safety and well-being. Decades of assistance had transformed Beacon Harbor from a struggling fishing community into one of the most successful working waterfronts in Maine, with a diversified economy that included traditional fishing operations, marine tourism, and related businesses that served both local residents and visitors attracted to the authentic maritime culture. The legacy of the night workers had also influenced the character of the community itself, creating a culture of mutual support and cooperation that extended beyond the fishing industry to include all aspects of community life. The example of anonymous service and generosity had inspired other residents to contribute their own skills and resources to community improvement projects, and mutual aid efforts. Detective Sergeant Reed had prepared a comprehensive report on the night workers for the town's bicentennial celebration, documenting their contributions to the community's economic development and cultural preservation. While the identity of the night workers remained unknown, their impact on Beacon Harbor was undeniable and would continue to benefit future generations of fishing families and other residents. Report had been included in the Bicentennial Historical Exhibition, where it had attracted considerable interest from visitors and residents who had never been fully aware of the extent of the anonymous assistance that had been provided to their community over the decades. The story of the night workers had become a source of pride and inspiration, demonstrating the positive impact that dedicated individuals could have when they chose to work for the common good. The harbor continued to operate around the clock, with fishing vessels departing before dawn and returning throughout the day and night according to the rhythms of tide, weather, and fishing success. The docks and facilities that had been improved and maintained by the night workers continued to serve the fishing fleet safely and efficiently, and the businesses and organizations that had received their support continued to contribute to the economic vitality of the community. As evening fell over Beacon Harbor and the lights of the fishing fleet began to appear on the horizon, the legacy of the night workers lived on in the well-maintained docks, the thriving businesses, and the strong sense of community that had been fostered by decades of anonymous service and generosity. The mystery of their identity might never be solved, but their contribution to the life and character of the working waterfront would continue to benefit the community for generations to come. The tide continued to rise and fall in Beacon Harbor, carrying with it the boats and the livelihoods of the fishing families who had made their home beside the sea, supported by the invisible network of care and assistance that had been woven into the fabric of their community by the mysterious night workers who had watched over them through the darkness and helped them face each new day with confidence and hope. Tonight, we journey to Cedar Ridge, a mountain village in the Colorado Rockies where the long winter months have always brought their own particular challenges and mysteries. The village, nestled at an elevation of nearly 9,000 feet, becomes largely isolated from November through March when heavy snows close the mountain passes and transform the community into a world unto itself. It was during these winter months, according to decades of police records, that the most puzzling disappearances in the village's history occurred with a regularity that both baffled and disturbed those who called this remote mountain community their home. Detective Lieutenant Michael Hartwell had been assigned to the newly formed Mountain County's Cold Case Task Force when he first encountered the files from Cedar Ridge in the spring of 2020. The task force had been created to review unsolved cases from small mountain communities throughout Colorado, many of which lacked the resources for extensive criminal investigations and had accumulated decades of unsolved missing person reports and unexplained incidents. The Cedar Ridge files represented one of the most extensive collections of winter disappearances that Detective Lieutenant Hartwell had ever encountered in his 23 years of law enforcement experience. Cedar Ridge, with its year-round population of fewer than 800 residents, had been established in the 1880s as a mining town serving the silver and gold operations in the surrounding mountains. When the mining boom ended in the early 1900s, the town had reinvented itself as a destination for tourists seeking mountain recreation and the authentic atmosphere of the historic western community. However, the harsh mountain winters had always limited the tourist season, leaving the permanent residents to face the challenges of extreme weather, isolation, and the various emergencies that could arise when the nearest major medical facility was more than 60 miles away over treacherous mountain roads. The Cedar Ridge Police Department had never consisted of more than 3 full-time officers, and during the winter months, the department often operated with minimal staffing as officers took leave or worked reduced schedules due to the limited activity in the isolated community. This meant that many incidents were handled by volunteer emergency responders or by state police officers who could reach the village when weather conditions permitted travel on the mountain. Highways, the earliest disappearance report in the Cedar Ridge. Files dated to January 1975, when Mrs. Dorothy Chun called the police to report that her neighbor, elderly Mr. Frank Kowalski, had not been seen for several days, despite the fact that smoke had been rising from his chimney and lights had been visible in his cabin windows each evening. Mrs. Chun, who lived in the cabin closest to Mr. Kowalski's property, had been keeping an informal watch on the 78-year-old man during the harsh winter weather, bringing him supplies and checking on his welfare during the worst storms. Officer James Murphy, who had responded to Mrs. Chun's call, found Mr. Kowalski's cabin unlocked and showed signs of recent habitation. The fire in the wood stove was burning steadily. Recently prepared food sat on the kitchen table, and Mr. Kowalski's winter coat and boots remained in their usual places near the door. However, there was no sign of the elderly man himself, despite a thorough search of the small cabin and the immediately surrounding area. The disappearance was particularly puzzling because Mr. Kowalski had been in poor health and had difficulty walking even short distances without assistance. The heavy snow outside his cabin showed no footprints or signs of disturbance, and the winter weather would have made it virtually impossible for him to travel far from his home without proper clothing and equipment. Officer Murphy had organized a search effort that included other residents of the area and volunteer emergency responders, but no trace of Mr. Kowalski was found despite extensive efforts that continued for several days. The search had been complicated by a severe snowstorm that arrived the day after Mr. Kowalski was reported missing, adding several feet of new snow that covered any tracks or evidence that might have indicated where he had gone or what had happened to him. When the storm passed and searchers were able to resume their efforts, the landscape had been transformed by the heavy snowfall, and any clues about Mr. Kowalski's disappearance had been buried beneath the fresh powder. Mr. Kowalski's body was never found, despite additional search efforts that resumed when the snow melted the following spring. His disappearance remained officially unsolved, though most residents of Cedar Ridge assumed that he had somehow become disoriented and had wandered away from his cabin during a period of confusion or medical emergency. The harsh mountain environment and the presence of wildlife in the area meant that bodies were sometimes never recovered, even when extensive search efforts were conducted. Detective Lieutenant Hartwell found that similar disappearances had occurred with disturbing regularity throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, each following a pattern that was remarkably consistent despite the passage of years and the involvement of different residents and investigating officers. The disappearances invariably occurred during the coldest and most isolated months of winter, typically involving elderly residents or individuals who lived alone in remote cabins scattered throughout the mountain valleys surrounding Cedar Ridge. In February 1978, Ms. Sarah Henderson, a retired teacher who lived in a cabin about 2 miles from the main village, was reported missing by the postal worker who had noticed that her mail was accumulating in her roadside mailbox. When Officer Murphy and volunteer searchers reached Ms. Henderson's cabin, they found it much as they had found Mr. Kowalski's home 3 years earlier, warm, recently occupied, with no signs of struggle or disturbance, but completely empty of its inhabitant. Ms. Henderson's disappearance was particularly mysterious because she had been known as a careful and practical woman who took extensive precautions during the winter months and who maintained regular contact with friends and family members in the village. She had been scheduled to meet with her book club the day after she was reported missing, and she had left behind preparations for the meeting, including fresh baked goods and notes about the novel they had been reading together. The pattern had continued through the 1980s, with at least one unexplained disappearance occurring each winter, sometimes 2 or 3 if the weather was particularly severe, or if multiple elderly residents were living alone in remote locations. The victims had included retired miners, artists and writers who had chosen the mountain lifestyle for its isolation and natural beauty, and longtime residents who had remained in Cedar Ridge after their families had moved to lower elevations for health or economic reasons. Officer Patricia Walsh, who had joined the Cedar Ridge Police Department in 1982, had investigated several of these winter disappearances and had developed her own theories about what might be causing the mysterious pattern. Her reports noted that the disappearances seemed to occur during periods of extreme weather, when travel was difficult or impossible, suggesting that the victims might have attempted to seek help or shelter and had become lost in the harsh conditions. However, Officer Walsh had also noted several details that didn't fit the explanation of weather-related accidents or medical emergencies. The missing persons had typically been experienced mountain residents who understood the dangers of winter travel and who had survived many previous harsh seasons without incident. Their homes had invariably been left in conditions suggesting sudden but not panic departure, with fires still burning and daily activities apparently interrupted. Mid-process. Detective Lieutenant Hartwell found that the reports from the 1990s included more detailed investigations and more sophisticated search and rescue efforts, but the mysterious disappearances had continued with the same inexplicable pattern. Advanced search techniques including helicopter surveys and trained search dogs had been employed, but no additional evidence had been discovered that would explain what was happening to Cedar Ridge's winter residents. In December 1994, the disappearance of Dr. Robert Martinez had attracted significant attention from state and federal investigators because Dr. Martinez had been a prominent psychiatrist who had moved to Cedar Ridge to write a book about the psychological effects of extreme isolation on mountain communities. Dr. Martinez had been conducting interviews with longtime residents and had been documenting the various ways that people adapted to the challenges of winter isolation in high-altitude environments. Dr. Martinez's cabin had been found in the same condition as the previous disappearance sites, warm, recently occupied, with evidence of interrupted daily activities, but no signs of struggle or disturbance. However, Dr. Martinez's research notes and recordings had provided investigators with additional insights into the social dynamics of the Cedar Ridge community during the winter months and the various stresses and challenges that residents faced during the long periods of isolation. The investigation of Dr. Martinez's disappearance had revealed that several residents had mentioned to him their concerns about what they described as the winter madness that seemed to affect some people during the longest and coldest months of the year. According to these interviews, some residents experienced episodes of disorientation, memory loss, and impaired judgment that were attributed to the combination of extreme weather, social isolation, and the physical stresses of living at high altitude. Dr. Martinez had been particularly interested in stories about residents who had reportedly wandered away from their homes during winter storms, apparently in states of confusion or delirium that had led them to make dangerous decisions about travel and survival. However, his research had been incomplete at the time of his disappearance, and the recordings and notes found in his cabin had not provided any definitive explanations for the pattern of winter disappearances. The search for Dr. Martinez had been the most extensive effort ever mounted in the Cedar Ridge area, involving state police investigators, federal agents, and specialized mountain rescue teams from throughout Colorado. The search had continued for weeks and had resumed multiple times during the following spring and summer, but no trace of Dr. Martinez or any clues about his fate had been discovered. Detective Lieutenant Hartwell found that the disappearances had continued through the late 1990s and early 2000s, but had begun to change in character as the demographics of Cedar Ridge evolved. The village had experienced an influx of new residents during this period, including retirees from urban areas who were attracted to the mountain lifestyle and seasonal residents who maintained vacation homes in the area. The new residents had different patterns of winter behavior than the longtime mountain dwellers, often maintaining closer contact with family and friends at lower elevations, and employing modern communication technologies that enabled them to stay connected even during severe weather. This had led to more rapid reporting of disappearances and more immediate search and rescue responses, but had not prevented the mysterious incidents from continuing to occur. In January 2001, the disappearance of Mrs. Eleanor Brennan had involved the most extensive real-time search effort in the area's history. Mrs. Brennan, a recent retiree who had moved to Cedar Ridge from Denver, had been reported missing within hours of her last confirmed contact with family members, and search teams had been deployed while weather conditions still permitted helicopter and vehicle access to remote areas. The search had involved more than 50 professional and volunteer searchers, including teams with specialized equipment for winter mountain rescue operations. However, despite the immediate response and extensive coverage of the search area, no trace of Mrs. Brennan had been found. Her cabin had been discovered in the same condition as previous disappearance sites, with all the familiar signs of sudden but not panicked departure. The Brennan investigation had included extensive interviews with all residents of the Cedar Ridge area, comprehensive searches of all buildings and structures that might have provided shelter, and detailed analysis of weather patterns and avalanche activity that might have affected her disappearance. Federal investigators had also examined the possibility that the disappearances might be connected to criminal activity, but no evidence had been found to support theories involving foul play or organized crime. Detective Lieutenant Hartwell's review of the case files had revealed that the winter disappearances in Cedar Ridge had shown several consistent patterns across nearly 3 decades of incidents. The disappearances had occurred exclusively during the months of December through March, when the village was most isolated and weather conditions were most severe. The victims had been disproportionately elderly residents who lived alone in remote locations, though the pattern had also included some younger adults who had chosen isolated mountain lifestyles. The physical evidence had been remarkably consistent across all the cases. Homes left in conditions suggesting sudden departure, with heating systems still operating and daily activities apparently interrupted mid-process. There had never been any signs of struggle, violence, or forced entry, and personal belongings, including money and valuable items, had always been left undisturbed. The environmental conditions at the time of the disappearances had typically involved severe weather that would have made travel dangerous or impossible. Yet the missing persons had apparently left their homes without adequate clothing or equipment for winter survival. Weather records had shown that most disappearances had occurred during or immediately before major snowstorms that would have created whiteout conditions and life-threatening cold temperatures. Detective Lieutenant Hartwell had consulted with medical experts, psychologists, and researchers who specialized in high-altitude physiology and the effects of extreme isolation on human behavior. These consultations had provided several potential explanations for the mysterious disappearances, though none had been definitively proven. Through the available evidence, one theory suggested that the disappearances might be related to altitude sickness or other medical conditions that were exacerbated by the extreme environment of high mountain winters. The combination of low oxygen levels, extreme cold, and social isolation could potentially cause disorientation, impaired judgment, and episodes of wandering that would lead people to leave their homes inappropriately dressed for the conditions. Another theory focused on the psychological effects of prolonged isolation and the various forms of cabin fever or seasonal affective disorders that could affect mountain residents during the long winter months. The experts had suggested that some individuals might experience episodes of delirium or altered mental states that could lead them to make irrational decisions about leaving their homes during dangerous weather. A third theory had considered the possibility that the disappearances might be connected to undiagnosed dementia or other cognitive impairments that were more common among elderly residents, and that might be triggered or worsened by the stresses of mountain winter living. This theory would explain the apparent confusion and poor judgment evident in the decision to leave warm, safe homes during life-threatening weather conditions. However, Detective Lieutenant Hartwell had also discovered aspects of the disappearances that didn't fit neatly into any of these medical or psychological explanations. The missing persons had included individuals who had previously demonstrated excellent adaptation to mountain living and who had shown no signs of cognitive impairment or mental health problems before their disappearances. Timing of the disappearances had also shown patterns that suggested something more systematic than random medical emergencies or psychological episodes. The incidents had occurred with remarkable regularity across multiple decades, affecting different individuals but following almost identical patterns of evidence and circumstances. Most puzzling of all had been the complete absence of any trace of the missing persons despite extensive search efforts that had covered thousands of square miles of mountain terrain. Even accounting for the harsh environment and the presence of wildlife, the complete lack of physical evidence was unusual and had led some investigators to consider explanations that went beyond conventional theories about weather-related accidents or medical emergencies. In 2010, the installation of improved communication systems and emergency response capabilities in the Cedar Ridge area had provided new opportunities to monitor and respond to potential disappearances. However, the winter disappearances had continued to occur despite better surveillance and faster emergency response times. The most recent disappearance had occurred in February 2018, when Mr. David Sullivan, a retired Forest Service employee who had lived in the mountains for more than 30 years, had vanished from his cabin during a blizzard that had isolated the area for nearly a week. Mr. Sullivan had been an experienced outdoorsman with extensive knowledge of mountain survival techniques, making his disappearance particularly puzzling to investigators who had assumed that his expertise would have protected him from the kinds of poor decisions that might have affected other victims. Detective Lieutenant Hartwell had concluded his review of the Cedar Ridge files with a comprehensive analysis that documented the scope and consistency of the winter disappearance pattern while acknowledging that no definitive explanation had been identified despite decades of investigation. The case had been classified as an ongoing cold case investigation due to the possibility that future incidents might provide additional evidence or clues that could help explain the mysterious pattern. The report had been shared with current law enforcement agencies serving the Cedar Ridge area, along with recommendations for enhanced monitoring and response procedures during the winter months. The analysis had also been provided to medical and psychological researchers who were studying the effects of extreme environments on human behavior, and who might be able to develop new insights into the factors that had contributed to the disappearances. The legacy of the winter disappearances continued to influence life in Cedar Ridge, with current residents taking additional precautions during the winter months and maintaining closer contact with neighbors and family members during periods of severe weather. The community had developed informal support networks and communication systems that helped ensure that elderly and isolated residents received regular contact and assistance during the most challenging periods of mountain winter living. The mystery had also attracted attention from researchers, journalists, and others who were interested in understanding the various ways that extreme environments could affect human behavior and survival. The Cedar Ridge disappearances had become a case study for emergency preparedness specialists and had contributed to improved protocols for mountain community safety and emergency response. As Detective Lieutenant Hartwell had reflected on the decades of unsolved disappearances, he had been struck by the resilience and adaptation of the Cedar Ridge community in the face of an ongoing mystery that had touched virtually every family in the area. The residents had learned to live with uncertainty and to support each other through the challenges of mountain winters while continuing to pursue the lifestyle and values that had drawn them to this remote and beautiful environment. The mountain winters continued to come to Cedar Ridge each year, bringing with them the familiar challenges of snow, cold, and isolation that had shaped the character of the community for more than a century. The disappearances had become part of the area's history and folklore, serving as reminders of the power of the mountain environment and the importance of community support and preparedness in the face of forces that remained beyond human understanding or control. The peaks surrounding Cedar Ridge continued to stand sentinel over the valley, holding their secrets in the snow and wind that had witnessed the comings and goings of generations of mountain residents. Whatever forces had been responsible for the winter disappearances, they remained as mysterious and elusive as the mountain weather itself, leaving behind only questions and the quiet determination of those who chose to make their homes in this beautiful but unforgiving landscape.